Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The first thing that invaded Gilbert S.'s senses was not the sight of the house, but its smell. It was a layered thing, this odor, a palimpsest of decay written over with a cloying, artificial sweetness. It was the scent of 1,000 rotting pumpkins, the waxy, vegetal stench of candle-gutted gourds left to spoil on a November porch. But beneath that, a sharper, more troubling note persisted. The sugary blast of cheap candy corn, so potent it felt like a film on the tongue, a chemical burn in the back of the throat. It was the smell of Halloween itself, not the festive, innocent kind, but the essence of the holiday left to fester in a closed room for a year. The candy and the rot having achieved a dreadful, inseparable marriage. He stood on the leaf-strewn path, the collar of his coat turned up against the October cold that seeped, damp and insistent, through to his bones. Behind him, the rest of his team disembarked from the van, their breaths pluming in the early evening air. The house, Blackwater Manor, loomed. It was a Gothic monstrosity of weathered gray stone and twisted, leafless ivy, its windows like sightless black eyes. It was a house that seemed to absorb the fading orange light of the autumn sunset rather than reflect it. "Are you getting that?" Gilbert asked, turning to Brianna. She was already pale, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on the house. "It has a chorus," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of dead leaves skittering across the gravel. 1,000 voices, all whispering at once. They ray excited. They've been waiting. Emmanuel snorted, hefting a case of electromagnetic field meters. They've been waiting for a bunch of suckers with grant money, you mean. That smell is probably a dead raccoon in the crawl space and a bag of forgotten candy in the pantry. Let us not ascribe cosmic significance to poor housekeeping. Charlene, Gilbert S.'s partner, touched his arm. Her hand was cold. "Don T. Manny, we ray here to observe, not to mock." She was the documentarian, the one who would stitch their findings into a coherent narrative. Her camera bag was slung over her shoulder, a heavy, professional thing. She saw the world in frames and sequences, and already her mind was composing the first shot. The stark, skeletal trees framing the house, the last sliver of bloody sun behind its jagged roofline, the first few porch lights of the distant town twinkling like indifferent stars. They were a world away from those safe, warm lights. The town of Harvest Hill, a mile down the road, was deep in its Halloween revelries. As they had driven in, they passed streets draped in orange and black, every porch boasting a carved jack-o'-lantern. Their flickering grins and triangular eyes seemed to watch the van pass, a silent, smirking audience to their folly. The air there had been filled with the wholesome scents of wood smoke and baking apples. Here, at the end of the long, private drive, the only scent was that of sweet decay. Gilbert, the determined scientist, felt a thrill that was not entirely professional. This was it, the Blackwater Manor, the site of the 1923 All Hallows Eve massacre, where reclusive industrialist Alistair Blackwater had, according to the fragmented, sensationalized reports, butchered 24 guests during a costume party before vanishing himself. The official story was insanity. The local legend was something else. Something about a bargain made on a night when the veil was thin. A door left open that should have remained shut. Gilbert intended to find proof, not of ghosts necessarily, but of the residual energy, the psychic imprint that such a concentrated burst of terror and violence might leave on a location. He believed in the measurable, the quantifiable. He would trap the echo in his machines. The massive oak door groaned open on its own as Gilbert reached for the tarnished brass knocker, a bat with outstretched wings. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if the house were drawing a deep, anticipatory breath. The smell from within rolled out in a thick, warm wave, that same nauseating blend of pumpkin guts and sugar. Atmospheric, Emmanuel said dryly, stepping inside first. Good use of servos and a timer. Amateur hour. The interior was a tomb of faded opulence. Dust sheets draped furniture like shrouds. A grand staircase swept upwards into darkness. But it was the decorations that arrested them. The house was still dressed for the party that had never ended. Faded paper bats and black crepe hung from the high, cobwebbed ceilings. A massive, dust-covered bowl sat on a marble-top table, filled not with candy, but with what looked like petrified, blackened apples. And everywhere there were jack-o'-lanterns, dozens of them, lining the mantelpiece, clustered in corners, their carved faces leering through a thick layer of dust. They were all carved into the same expression, a wide, screaming mouth and hollow, terrified eyes. No one has lived here for a century, Charlene murmured, her camera already clicking, the flash illuminating the cavernous foyer in stark, momentary bursts. Who decorated? Brianna stood rigid in the center of the room, her hands pressed to her temples. They never left, she breathed. They lay all still here, in their costumes. Can you hear the music? There was no music. Only the sound of the wind outside, moaning in the chimney, and the dry rustle of what might have been leaves, or the scuttling of insects inside the walls. But as Gilbert listened, his own rational mind beginning to feel porous, he thought he could almost grasp the ghost of a melody. A tinny, old-time waltz played on a gramophone, long since broken. They set up their base of operations in what had once been the ballroom. It was a vast, hollow space, its parquet floor scarred and stained. A massive crystal chandelier hung overhead, its prisms caked with grime. Gilbert and Emmanuel began unpacking the equipment. Thermal cameras, digital voice recorders, Geiger counters, and a custom-built device of Gilbert S.'s own design that he called a resonator, meant to detect and amplify fluctuations in the local Higgs field. It was a beautiful, nonsensical piece of pseudoscience, and he loved it. Emmanuel set up a bank of monitors, the cool blue glow a stark contrast to the oppressive, orange-hued twilight filtering through the grimy windows. "All right, house," he said to the empty room. "Show us what you've got. Or Dante, I am getting paid either way." The first night was a study in mounting tension. The EMF meters remained stubbornly silent. The thermal cameras showed nothing but the gradual cooling of the stone walls. But the small, personal digital recorders, left running in empty rooms, captured things. The sound of rustling taffeta, a child's distant, sobbing laugh, the crisp snap of a twig or a bone underfoot, and once a clear, whispered phrase that made the hair on Charlene's arms stand up. "The mask stays on after midnight." Brianna was their canary in this coal mine. She would flinch at nothing, stare into corners for hours, her lips moving in silent conversation. She refused to go upstairs. "The energy is too dense up there," she said, her voice trembling. "It's like wading through syrup. And the things at the party, they Dante-like to be looked at directly." Emmanuel dismissed it as suggestion and fatigue. Gilbert recorded her statements meticulously, his scientific curiosity warring with a growing, primal unease. The house was getting to them. The constant, sweet-rotten smell was in their clothes, their hair, their dreams. Gilbert started seeing things from the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement in a dusty mirror, the shift of a shadow that had no source. It was vague, dreamlike, the boundary between the scene and the imagined growing thin and permeable, letting his mind slip. On the second day, the day before Halloween, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavier, colder. The jack-o'-lanterns in the foyer, though still covered in dust, seemed to have shifted their positions, their screaming faces now all turned towards the interior of the house. Charlene, reviewing her footage, found a shot of the ballroom empty 1 second, and in the next frame, filled with swirling, costumed figures, their faces blurred and indistinct. The image lasted for 3 frames before reverting to an empty room. She said nothing, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. That afternoon, Brianna, in a trance-like state, walked to the grand fireplace and began scraping at the soot-blackened brick with her fingernails. "He put it here," she chanted. "The key is in the king's mouth. The key is in the king's mouth." Gilbert and a reluctant Emmanuel helped her, and behind a loose brick, they found a small, tarnished silver key. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally so. The discovery shook Emmanuel's skepticism. "A plant," he insisted, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Left by some previous ghost hunter. No one else has been in here," Gilbert said quietly. "The estate has been sealed since the police investigation." As dusk fell on October 30th, the town of Harvest Hill was at the peak of its festive frenzy. The sound of distant, happy children's laughter and the occasional firework carried on the wind, a cruel reminder of a normal world that felt galaxies away. Inside Blackwater Manor, the festive atmosphere was a grotesque parody. The ghost of the music grew louder. The smell of candy and decay intensified, now undercut with a new metallic tang, like old blood. Emmanuel, trying to reassert his rationality, decided to investigate the source of the smell. He followed his nose to the kitchen, a cavernous room with a cold, black iron stove. The sweet-rotten stench was overpowering here. In the center of a vast, scarred wooden table sat a single, fresh pumpkin. It was uncarved, gleaming with a wet, orange vitality. A large, black-handled knife was buried to the hilt in its crown. A joke Emmanuel said to the empty room, his voice echoing. Very funny. He reached for the knife to pull it out, to prove it was just a knife, just a pumpkin. The moment his fingers closed around the handle, the kitchen door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The lights on the monitors in the ballroom flickered and died. From the kitchen, they heard a wet, crunching sound, followed by a single, choked cry that was abruptly cut off. Gilbert and Charlene reached the kitchen door first, but it was locked, the old wood groaning as they threw their shoulders against it. From inside, there was only silence. Then, a new sound began. A slow, deliberate scraping. It was the sound of a knife, carving into firm, wet flesh. When the door finally gave way, the kitchen was empty. The pumpkin was gone. The knife was gone. All that remained was a pile of fresh, stringy orange guts on the table, and a single, perfect triangle of pumpkin rind, like an eye. Of Emmanuel, there was no trace. Panic, cold and absolute, set in. The skeptic was gone, and with him, the last vestiges of their rational world. The house was no longer a subject of study. It was a predator, and they were its prey. The countdown to Halloween was no longer a date on a calendar. It was a ticking clock on their lives. Brianna sat on the ballroom floor, rocking back and forth. "It's almost time," she whispered. "The veil is tearing. He's coming back to finish the party." Gilbert, his hands shaking, fiddled with his resonator. The machine, which had shown nothing but random noise for 2 days, was now spiking wildly. The needles were dancing, the speakers emitting a low, guttural static that resolved, at times, into something that sounded like language. He was getting his proof. The house was a wound in reality, and on Halloween night, it would bleed. Halloween night arrived. The sun bled out behind the hills, and a vast, swollen harvest moon rose, its color a sickly, bruised orange. In the town, children in costumes of superheroes and monsters flitted from door to door, their bags growing heavy with loot. In Blackwater Manor, the final act was beginning. The lights in the house died for good, leaving them with only the flickering glow of battery-powered lanterns and the cold light of the moon through the windows. The ghostly music was no longer a suggestion. It was a full-bodied orchestra, a waltz that was both elegant and deeply wrong. The air grew thick with the scent of perfume, sweat, and that ever-present, coppery, sweet rot. Then the guests began to appear. They were not solid, not quite. They were impressions in the air, shimmering heat haze figures in roaring 20s formal wear, and elaborate, grotesque masks. A man with the head of a stag. A woman with the face of a weeping angel. A child in a Jester S motley, its bells making no sound. They swirled through the ballroom, their feet not quite touching the floor, their laughter a soundless vibration that rattled the teeth. Charlene, her documentary instinct shattered, filmed it all, her camera a futile shield against the impossible. Gilbert watched, his scientific mind finally broken and remade into something simpler, more ancient: terror. This was not an echo. This was a recording playing itself out in real time, and they were now part of it. Brianna stood, her face serene. Yes, here, at the top of the grand staircase, a figure materialized. He was tall, dressed in a fine, dark suit that was impeccably tailored. But his head was not a head. It was a jack-o'-lantern, vast and glowing from within, its carved features not a simple grin, but a rictus of such profound, existential agony that to look upon it was to feel your own sanity begin to unravel. It was the king of the pumpkin patch. It was Alistair Blackwater, returned. He descended the stairs, each step a hollow thud that echoed in the silent music. The phantom guests parted before him, their masked heads bowing in deference. He moved with a terrible, deliberate purpose, not towards Gilbert or Charlene, but towards Brianna. She did not run. She looked up at the pumpkin-headed thing, her eyes filled not with fear, but with a dreadful recognition. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to leave the party." The thing reached out a hand that was made of gnarled vine and pale, human flesh. It did not touch her. Instead, it gestured to an empty space on the ballroom floor, and Brianna began to dance. She waltzed with an invisible partner, her movements graceful, her face a mask of tragic ecstasy, spinning and spinning through the crowd of shimmering, silent guests. Gilbert tried to go to her, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The air had become syrup. He could only watch as the Pumpkin King turned its horrific gaze upon him. A voice, not a sound, but an idea forced directly into his cortex, filled his head. It was the voice of the house, of the land, of the ancient fear that lived in the heart of Halloween. You sought proof. You craved explanation. Now you shall be both observer and participant. The ritual requires witnesses. The door must be propped open. The phantom music swelled to a deafening crescendo. The costumed guests stopped their dancing and turned, as one, to face Gilbert and Charlene. Their masks were no longer static. They were changing, melting, reforming into the faces of Gilbert, of Charlene, of Brianna, of Emmanuel, twisted into expressions of terror and agony. The Pumpkin King raised its arms. The walls of the ballroom seemed to dissolve, bleeding away into a vortex of swirling orange and black. Gilbert felt a pulling, a tearing at the very fabric of his being. He was not just seeing the past, he was being woven into it. He saw the knife, the real knife, flashing in the candlelight of a century ago. He saw the screams that were now silent. He felt the terror, the ecstasy, the final, bloody communion of that long-ago night. He was Gilbert, the scientist, and he was also a guest at Alistair Blackwater's party, and he was the man with the knife. The boundaries between investigator and subject, between past and present, between self and other, dissolved completely. He saw Charlene, her camera falling from her limp hands, as a woman in a peacock feather mask led her away into the swirling crowd. He saw Brianna, still dancing, her form beginning to shimmer and fade, becoming one with the phantoms. He saw, for a fleeting second, Emmanuel's face on one of the guests, his mouth open in a silent scream, a jagged jack-o'-lantern smile carved into his cheeks. The last thing Gilbert knew was the overwhelming, suffocating sweetness, the smell of a million rotting Halloweens, filling his lungs, his soul, as the orange glow of the Pumpkin King consumed everything. Gilbert woke up. He was in his own bed. The morning sun, pale and weak, streamed through the window. The digital clock on his bedside table read 7:03 a.m. November 1st. He sat up, his heart pounding, his body slick with a cold sweat. It was a dream. A horrible, vivid, terrifying dream. He looked over at Charlene, sleeping peacefully beside him. Relief, warm and dizzying, flooded through him. He reached out to shake her, to tell her about the nightmare, to hold her and reassure himself of the solid, real world. His hand touched her shoulder. She was cold, unnaturally cold. He pulled the duvet back. She was still wearing the clothes she had worn to the Harvest Hill Town Festival the night before. And clutched in her rigid, frozen hand was a single piece of candy corn. Its waxy, orange and yellow surface was smeared with something dark and red, like a bloody fingerprint. He stumbled out of bed, out of the room, into the hall of their perfectly normal suburban home. The house was silent, too silent. He ran downstairs, into the living room, and stopped. There on the coffee table sat a pumpkin. It was small, lopsided, uncarved, and buried to the hilt in its plump, orange side was a large, black-handled knife. From the kitchen, he heard a faint, familiar sound. The slow, deliberate scraping of a knife against something firm and wet. The world around him seemed to waver, the edges of his vision blurring with a familiar, orange haze. The scent of candy corn and rotting pumpkin bloomed in the air, faint at first, then overpowering. He knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in his veins, that he had not escaped the house at all. The house had simply folded itself around him, a new skin over an old horror. The party was not over. It had just changed venues. He looked down at his own hands, half expecting to see them made of gnarled vine and pale flesh. The line between the dream and the waking world dissolved, and he understood the final, terrible secret of Blackwater Manor. There was no leaving. There was only the endless, sweet, and rotting Halloween, and the dance went on forever. The whispering voices in the walls were his own. The laughter was his own. And the face of the king, he knew, when he finally dared to look in a mirror, would be his own. He walked toward the kitchen, not because he wanted to, but because the house, his house, was pulling him there. Each step on the familiar carpet was a monumental effort, as if he were wading through cold syrup. The scraping sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was the sound of a blade methodically separating flesh from rind. The kitchen door was ajar. He pushed it open. The room was empty. The overhead light was off, but the autumn sun cast a weak, jaundiced glow through the window over the sink. The scraping was coming from the table. There was no one there, but the black-handled knife was moving on its own, hovering in the air, carving into the pumpkin that had been on the coffee table moments before. Shards of orange rind and wet, stringy guts piled up beside it. Gilbert watched, paralyzed, as the invisible hand finished its work. The knife dropped onto the table with a heavy, final clatter. The pumpkin now wore a face. It was not a scary face. It was his own face, carved in perfect, agonized detail, his mouth open in a silent scream. From the living room, the tinny, ghostly waltz began to play. He turned, his limbs moving like a marionette as the living room was no longer his living room. The walls seemed to stretch away into a deeper darkness, the furniture blurring into the shapes of draped sheets and dust-covered finery. Phantom figures in formal wear and grotesque masks shimmered at the edges of his vision. Their laughter, a silent pressure in the air. He looked back at the kitchen table. The jack-o'-lantern with his face was gone. In its place was a small, tarnished silver key. The key from the fireplace. The key is in the King-S mouth, a cold, dry vine, like the tendril of a dying plant, brushed against his cheek from behind. He did not need to turn around to know what stood there. He could feel the heat of its internal, hellish candle, could smell the sickly sweet scent of its roasting flesh. The voice was in his head again, not a sound, but a command woven into his thoughts. Finish the ritual. His hand, no longer his own, reached out and picked up the key. It was so cold it burned his skin. He walked back toward the stairs, his feet carrying him to the bathroom. He saw his reflection in the mirror above the sink. He looked pale, terrified himself. But as he watched, his features began to soften, to blur at the edges. His skin took on a waxy, orange hue. His jaw seemed to lengthen, his head to swell and change shape. He raised the key with a trembling hand. He did not want to do it, but the compulsion was absolute, a fundamental law of this new reality he inhabited. He brought the key to his own lips, to his mouth, which was no longer entirely his own. He did not insert it. His mouth opened, wider than should be possible, and the key was drawn inside, swallowed by the darkness within him. The transformation was instantaneous and horrifying. His head erupted in a blaze of orange light. His vision narrowed to 2 triangular slits. His mouth was frozen in the same rictus of agony he had seen carved into the pumpkin. He was looking out from inside the mask. He was the king. He turned from the mirror. The phantom guests were more solid now, their their silent waltz filling the space of his suburban home. He saw Charlene among them, twirling in her peacock feather mask, her eyes empty. He saw Brianna, still dancing. He saw Emmanuel, his carved smile a permanent fixture. He descended the stairs, each step a hollow thud that was both a memory and a new event. The guests parted for him. This was his house. This was his party. It had always been. The door was propped open, and the world outside was just another, larger room in the endless manor. The laughter he heard was his own, echoing from 1,000 throats, a soundless vibration that was the only music left. The ritual was complete. The witness had become the host, and the night of Halloween stretched on forever. He moved through the dancers, his new form both a prison and a source of a terrible, ancient power. The phantom guests reached for him with cold, insubstantial hands, their touch like a draft from a forgotten tomb. Their adoration was a wave of pure dread that sustained him. He understood now that Alistair Blackwater had not been a man, but a role, a crown of suffering passed from one soul to the next. He had sought to document the king, and had instead inherited the throne. His glowing gaze fell upon Charlene. She was trapped in the steps of the waltz, her face a blank slate of terror beneath her mask. A thought, not his own, but the House S, willed her to stop. Her feet froze mid-step. The phantom partnering her dissipated into a swirl of dust motes in the moonlight. She stood alone in the center of the swirling chaos, her body trembling. She looked at him, at the burning pumpkin head, and the suit that was now a part of his form, and a spark of recognition broke through her trance. Gilbert. Her voice was a dry, papery whisper. He tried to answer, to force his name through the frozen rictus of his mouth, but all that emerged was a puff of smoke smelling of spice and decay. He took a step toward her, his intention a confused storm of Gilbert S. love and the King S. hunger. He raised a hand, a gnarled assemblage of root and bone. A silent command flowed from him. The other dancers stilled. The ghostly music halted, leaving a silence more profound than any sound. Every masked face, every shimmering form, turned to look at Charlene. The pressure of their collective gaze was a physical weight. The King S will became action. The peacock feather mask on Charlene S' face began to change. The brilliant blues and greens darkened, bleeding into a dull, bruised orange. The feathers curled and shrank, morphing into the rough, segmented texture of a pumpkin S skin. The mask closed in on her face, tightening, fusing to her flesh. She clawed at it, a muffled scream trapped behind the new, unyielding surface. Her struggle slowed, then ceased. Her body took on the same faint shimmer as the other guests. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a permanent part of the decor. Gilbert felt a pang of something lost, regret, but it was a small, distant thing. A pebble dropped into a deep, dark well. The King S consciousness was a vast, dark ocean, and Gilbert was just a cupful of water thrown into it. He turned his attention to the rest of the house, his kingdom. He could feel its boundaries now, not as walls and a roof, but as a sphere of influence. It extended down the street, pulling the festive decorations of the neighbors into its grim parody. Inflatable ghosts writhed in true agony. Plastic skeletons turned their heads to look at him with empty, knowing sockets. The laughter of real children outside sounded thin and desperate, a fleeting noise against the eternal silence of his ballroom. This was his purpose, to perpetuate the party, to feed on the fear of the season and in turn give it a home. He was the anchor. The ritual was not a single night-s event, but a continuous state of being. He would draw others in, the curious, the lost, the skeptical. They would become his guests, then his decorations, then part of the very foundation of the growing manor. He walked to the window and looked out at the waking world, a world now tinted with a perpetual orange twilight. A group of children in costumes were walking down the sidewalk, their parents following behind. One child, dressed as a pirate, looked up at the window. The child saw him. The king raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. The child did not wave back. He simply stared, his face a mask of a different kind of fear, the primal understanding that the monster in the story was real and was watching him. The king savored the moment, a sweet, sharp flavor amidst the constant taste of rot. He had his proof. He had his explanation. He was both observer and participant forever. The harvest moon outside was no longer a passing phase of the night sky. It was the unblinking eye of his domain, and the dance, the endless, silent waltz, began again. The pirate child's gaze remained locked with his for a moment longer, a tiny spark of genuine terror in the bland, safe suburb. Then the child's mother, chatting on her phone, tugged his hand and pulled him along the sidewalk. The moment broke, but the connection remained, a thin, taut thread of dread that stretched from the window to the retreating boy. The king knew that thread would not snap. It would linger, a seed of unease that would grow in the dark of the boy's mind, waiting for next October, waiting for the call. Inside, the waltz resumed. The guests swirled, their movements more fluid, more practiced, as if the incorporation of Charlene had solidified the reality of the ballroom. He saw her now, standing perfectly still by the fireplace, her pumpkin head mask identical to a dozen others, a permanent, silent statue in the court of the king. She was both a warning and an invitation. A new sensation prickled at the edges of his awareness, a buzzing, foreign energy. He turned his great, glowing head. The source was on the floor near the entrance to the dining room. Charlene's camera. It had been forgotten, a relic of a world that no longer existed for them. Its little red recording light was still on, a tiny, stubborn eye witnessing the impossible. The king felt a ripple of displeasure, a static that disturbed the smooth flow of terror. This was an artifact that did not belong. It was a tool of observation from outside the ritual, and its continued operation was a splinter in the seamless reality he now commanded. He willed it to stop. The camera did not obey. The light remained, a pinprick of defiant red. A guest, a shimmering man in a tuxedo with a ram-esque skull for a head, drifted toward the camera. He reached a translucent hand to pick it up. The moment his fingers touched the plastic casing, a jolt of visible energy, like orange lightning, arced from the device. The phantom man recoiled, his form flickering and destabilizing, a silent scream contorting the bone mask. He dissipated into a cloud of faint, sweet-smelling mist. The camera was protected. Or rather, it was now a part of the haunting in a way that even the king could not simply dismiss. It was documenting its own reality, creating a record that was both within and without the event. The king took a heavy step toward it. The floorboards groaned under his weight, a sound that was both real and remembered. He stood over the device, his internal fire casting a flickering, monstrous shadow over it. He saw his own reflection, distorted and awful, in the camera's lens. He knew then that the recording was not just a file on a memory card. It was another thread, like the one connected to the pirate boy. But this one led back to the world of the living, to servers and screens and skeptical minds. It was a leak in the perfect isolation of his kingdom. It was hope for anyone who might ever see it, and it was a threat to him. He could not destroy it, but he could curate it. He could make it his. He focused his will, not on stopping the camera, but on the image it was capturing. He poured the essence of the party into the lens, the swirling dancers, the agonized masks, the overwhelming sense of eternal recurrence. He made sure the recording would show the final, inescapable truth, that there was no exit, only the dance. And then, with a final, concentrated thought, he imprinted a single, clear message onto the recording. A message that would be found by whoever eventually watched it. A whisper that would seep from the speakers and into the listener's soul. The party is always looking for new guests. Satisfied, he left the camera where it lay, its little red light a beacon in the gloom. Let it record. Let it be found. Every skeptic who watched it would become a potential door. Every shudder of fear it provoked would be a tiny offering to his throne. The hunt for proof was the very thing that fed him, and now he had created the perfect bait. The ritual was not just in the ballroom, it was in the seeking. And he was the only one who would never have to seek again. The days began to bleed together, not in a linear fashion, but in a looping, spiraling dance. The sun outside the window was a permanent, sickly orange disk, neither rising nor setting, but hanging in a state of perpetual twilight. Gilbert, the king, felt the rhythm of his new existence settle into his core. The phantom guests were his thoughts given form, their silent movements a reflection of the endless cycles of his own captive mind. He became aware of the house breathing. The walls would expand and contract with a slow, sighing creak. The floorboards would sometimes soften under his feet like damp earth. Portraits of people he had never known would appear on the walls, their faces slowly morphing into the jack-o'-lantern visages of his court. He had thought the house was a stage for the party, but he now understood it was a living extension of himself, growing and changing with his reign. A new pull tugged at his awareness, different from the distant threads of fear from the outside world. This was closer, more intimate. It was coming from upstairs, from the room that had once been his and Charlene's. He ascended, the stairs groaning a welcome. The door was closed, but from the crack beneath it, a faint, golden light pulsed, out of place in the orange gloom. He pushed the door open. The room was as it had been on the morning he woke up, a frozen tableau of a life that no longer was. The bed was neatly made. The digital clock was stuck at 7:03 a.m. But in the center of the room, hovering a foot above the carpet, was a small, shimmering sphere of light. Within it, he could see a memory playing out, clear and bright. It was himself, the old Gilbert, laughing as he tried to help Charlene pin a stray peacock feather back onto her mask before the festival. The memory was saturated with a warmth and a love that felt alien to him now, a flavor he could remember but no longer taste. This was a remnant, a piece of his soul that had not fully been consumed in the transformation. It was a seed of the man he had been, preserved by the very intensity of the emotion it held. The king felt a surge of revulsion. This was a flaw, a weakness, a pocket of resistance within his own kingdom. He willed it to dissolve, to be absorbed into the orange haze. The sphere flickered, but held firm, the sound of his own forgotten laughter echoing faintly in the room. He reached a gnarled hand toward it. As his fingers, made of root and withered flesh, neared the light, a searing pain shot up his arm. It was not a physical pain, but the pain of remembrance, of a self he had been forced to shed. He recoiled. He could not destroy it. Just as he could not destroy the camera, he could not eradicate this last echo of Gilbert. It was too deeply woven into the fabric of this room, this memory. The ritual required a sacrifice, and a part of that sacrifice was this eternal, conscious regret. It was the source of the silent scream on his own face. He did the only thing he could do. He made it a part of the exhibit. He let the sphere of light hang there, a beautiful, tragic display in the museum of his damnation. It would serve as a lesson for any future guest who might stumble this far, a glimpse of the cost of the crown. He turned and left the room, closing the door on the laughing ghost of his past. The pang of loss was sharper this time, a thorn in the side of the king. He descended the stairs, back to his waiting court. The dancers parted, and he took his place at the center of the ballroom. The silent music swelled. He looked out the window. The pirate boy was there again, standing at the end of the driveway, just staring. He had been drawn back. The thread had tightened. The boy took a hesitant step forward, then another, his small feet carrying him toward the porch, toward the front door, toward the irresistible, rotting sweetness of the party. The king settled into his throne, the weight of his own history and the promise of eternity upon him. The dance was waiting. The door was opening, and the harvest was never ending. The boy's hand, small and trembling, reached for the brass doorknob. The king felt the moment of contact, like a key turning in a lock deep within his own chest. The door swung inward, not on a suburban foyer, but on the grand, shadow-draped expanse of the ballroom. The boy, the pirate, stood frozen on the threshold, his eyes wide with a fear that was no longer simple childhood fright. He was seeing the true party. The phantom guests turned their masked heads in unison, a silent, welcoming committee. The air grew thick, sweet, and heavy. The boy took one step inside, then another, drawn by a power he could not comprehend. His plastic cutlass clattered to the floor, a meaningless toy in the face of this ancient ceremony. The king watched, a spectator and a conductor. This was the purpose. This was the sustenance. He felt the boy's terror, a bright, sharp flavor, and it strengthened him, smoothing over the ragged edges of the memory still burning upstairs. The boy's small form began to shimmer, his pirate costume melting away, replaced by the faint, formal wear of a guest. A simple, unadorned white mask began to form over his face. But then something shifted. The boy's eyes, just before the mask solidified, did not look at the swirling dancers or the terrifying king. They looked past the king, up the stairs. He was looking toward the source of the golden light, toward the memory of laughter and love. A single, clear tear traced a path down his cheek, glistening with a purity that seemed to burn in the oppressive atmosphere. The king felt a jolt. That tear was a rebellion. It was a sentiment that should not have been possible here, a feeling that belonged to the world outside, the world of sun and linear time. For a fraction of a second, the frozen rictus of his own pumpkin face felt less like a crown and more like a prison. The moment passed. The mask completed its formation, blank and serene. The boy's small body stilled, then joined the waltz, a new permanent resident in the endless manor. The party absorbed him, and the rhythm of the dance reclaimed the hall. Yet the king remained unsettled. The tear had been a flaw in the ritual, a crack in the foundation. He looked up toward the closed bedroom door, feeling the persistent pulse of that golden sphere. It was not just a memory. It was a beacon. It had called to the boy, not with terror, but with something else, something the king had thought long extinguished. He realized with a dawning, cold horror that his kingdom was not perfectly sealed. The very act of sacrifice had created a weakness, a vulnerability tied to the humanity he had consumed. The camera was a leak to the outside world, and the memory was a leak to the past. Both were doors he could not permanently close. The harvest was never ending, but so, it seemed, was the resistance. His eternity would not be a quiet reign. It would be a perpetual, silent war against the echoes of what he had been, fought in the ballroom of his own soul. And the dance, for all its silence, was now filled with the faint, persistent echo of a single falling tear. The echo of the tear became a constant, low hum beneath the waltz's silent melody. It was a dissonance only he could hear, a reminder of the flaw in his perfect, terrible world. He tried to bury it under new arrivals, drawing in a pair of teenage daredevils who had come seeking the legendary haunted house. Their bravado turned to delicious, soul-rending panic as the front door sealed behind them. And for a time, their sharp, fresh fear was a potent distraction. They joined the dance, their modern clothes dissolving into shimmering formal wear, their faces hidden behind new, vacant masks. But the hum remained. It grew louder when he looked at Charlene S., still form by the fireplace. It pulsed in time with the golden light from the bedroom upstairs. The king found his attention divided, his consciousness split between the expansion of his domain and the internal fracture that seemed to be widening. The house, an extension of his will, began to show the strain. In a dark corner of the ballroom, a patch of wallpaper peeled back, revealing not plaster and lathe, but a swirling, chaotic vortex of orange and black light. From it, he could hear faint, real sounds, the rustle of wind through actual dried leaves, the distant, cheerful call of a living person from a world that was continuing on without him. This was new. This was dangerous. The ritual was meant to be a closed loop, a self-sustaining system. These leaks were a form of decay he could not control. He moved to the vortex, intending to seal it with his will. As he approached, the image within it clarified. He saw his own street, but in the bright, careless light of a summer afternoon. A moving van was parked 2 houses down. A family was carrying boxes, laughing. The sight was like a physical blow. It was a timeline from which he was utterly excised. A figure stepped out of the van, and the king froze. It was an older man, his face weathered but kind, holding a cardboard box labeled kitchen. He had his father's eyes. The man looked up, directly toward the house, toward the vortex. A faint, puzzled frown on his face, as if he'd felt a sudden chill. The connection was immediate and agonizing. This was not a random thread of fear. This was a thread of memory, of love, a hook sunk deep into the core of what was left of Gilbert. The king felt a tearing sensation, a schism in his being. The part of him that was the Pumpkin King roared in defiance, its hunger repulsed by this pure, untainted emotion. The part that was Gilbert wept with a longing so profound it threatened to shatter his solid form. He could not let this continue. He focused all his energy, all the accumulated terror of his court, and pushed against the vortex. The image of his father wavered, the summer light dimming. But as it closed, the man's head turned, and for a single, impossible second, their eyes met. There was no fear in his father's gaze, only a deep, abiding sadness and a flicker of recognition. The vortex snapped shut, leaving only the patterned wallpaper. The king stood there, trembling. The silent ballroom swirled around him, a perfect machine of horror. But he was no longer its perfect master. He was a king with a rebel in his court, a ghost in his walls, and a crack in his throne. The tear had not been an end, but a beginning. The first drop of a rain that could, in time, wash his entire kingdom away. And he was powerless to stop it, for the source of the flood was not outside. It was locked within the pumpkin on his own shoulders. The silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with the unspoken truth of his own fragility. He turned from the wall, his movements less fluid, the grace of the monster giving way to the stiff uncertainty of a man haunted. The guests sensed it. Their waltz, once a seamless flow of terror, developed a minute hesitation, a stutter in the collective step. They were a reflection of him, and he was no longer a pure reflection of the ritual. He found his gaze pulled relentlessly toward the stairs. The golden light from the bedroom seemed brighter now, pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm that mimicked a heartbeat. It was an accusation. It was a call. He had to confront it. To leave it festering was to allow the decay to spread. He ascended again, each step an effort of will. The door was ajar, and the warm light spilled out, painting the gloomy hallway in a hue that felt blasphemous. He pushed it open. The sphere of memory still hung in the center of the room, but it had changed. The scene within was no longer a happy memory of the festival. It was a later moment, a quiet evening. He saw himself, Gilbert, and Charlene on the edge of the bed, her head on his shoulder. They weren't talking. They were just sitting in a comfortable silence, her hand in his. The intimacy of the moment was a different kind of weapon, more piercing than any memory of joy. It spoke of a shared life, of small, quiet understandings, of a peace that now felt more distant than any star. The king stood at the threshold, unable to enter. The light pushed against him, a tangible force of rejection. This room was no longer part of his domain. It was a sovereign state of memory, and he was an invading tyrant. From within the sphere, the memory Gilbert turned his head. He wasn't looking at Charlene. He was looking directly at the king in the doorway. His eyes were not filled with fear or anger, but with a profound, weary pity. A sound escaped the king's throat, a dry, rasping thing that was meant to be a roar of denial, but came out as a choked gasp. He stumbled back, slamming the door shut. He leaned his great head against the wood, feeling the vibrant, living memory thrumming against his brow. He could not destroy it. He could not control it. He could only contain it, and in doing so, contain a part of himself that was now in active, silent rebellion. Down below, the dance continued, but the rhythm was broken. The new guest, the former pirate boy, was not moving in sync with the others. His steps were slightly off, his masked head tilted as if listening to a distant song. And around his blank, white mask, etched not in paint, but in faint, shimmering light, was the trail of a single, perfect tear. The king descended the stairs, the weight of his crown immense. He saw the boy's imperfect dance, saw the hesitant guests, saw the cracks in his world not as threats to be sealed, but as symptoms of a terminal illness. The hunt for proof fed him, yes, but the memory of love was starving him. His eternity stretched before him, not as a reign, but as a sentence to be endured, moment by agonizing moment, in the gilded cage of his own making. The party was indeed always looking for new guests, but the king, for the first time, wondered if he was now the one who was truly and forever trapped. The thought was a poison ivy, its roots digging deep into the soil of his mind. Trapped. He was the warden and the inmate, the hunter and the thing chained to the post. The grand ballroom, once a testament to his power, now felt like the belly of a beast, and he was its slowly digesting heart. He retreated to his throne, the twisted vine and gourd creaking under his weight. He closed his eyes, not to rest, but to look inward. He sought the core of the ritual, the ancient, binding magic that had promised him dominion. He found it, a knot of dark energy pulsing at the center of his being, but its light was dimmer, its rhythm faltering. The memory, the tear, the vortex, they were not just flaws. They were antithetical to the ritual's nature. The ceremony demanded a complete surrender, a perfect consumption of the self. He had held something back. He had, in a moment of subconscious defiance, preserved a seed, and that seed was now growing. A new sensation prickled at the edge of his awareness. It was not the sharp, delicious tang of fear from a new arrival, nor was it the agonizing pull of his father's memory. This was subtler, a faint, melodic thread of curiosity. It was accompanied by a soft, rhythmic clicking sound that was entirely alien to the silent waltz. He opened his eyes and turned his gaze outward through the walls of the house to the edge of his property. A woman stood there, middle-aged, with a kind, studious face. She held a strange device in her hand, a digital recorder, and was speaking into it in a low, clear voice. Readings are anomalous, to say the least. Significant temperature drop localized to the property line. EMF is off the charts. And the audio, listen. She held the recorder up. The king heard it then, the sound that had been pricking at him. It was the faint, ghostly echo of the waltz, the one only he and his guests could feel, somehow captured and translated into a whisper of static and a rhythmic, clicking beat by her machine. She wasn't a skeptic seeking to debunk, nor was she a thrill-seeker wanting a scare. She was a researcher, a paranormal investigator. She was not offering fear, she was offering study. She was picking at the threads of his reality with the cool, detached precision of a scientist. This was a new kind of threat. Fear fed him. Belief, even the belief of a skeptic, strengthened the ritual. But understanding, analysis, that could unravel it. He felt a cold tendril of panic, a sensation he had not experienced since his transformation. He tried to pull at her, to summon an image of a lost child or a whispering voice from the porch to frighten her, to turn her curiosity into terror. The image formed in her mind, a child's face at the window. The king felt her heart jump, but then her voice, calm and analytical, spoke again into her recorder. Subject is responsive, attempting visual manifestation. Note increased tingling in the scalp and a sensation of being watched. Fascinating. She was documenting his attempts to scare her. She was treating his power like a phenomenon to be catalogued. Her curiosity was a shield, and her lack of primal fear left him feeling hollow, impotent. He watched, powerless, as she took a small camera from her bag and began to take pictures of the house. With each flash, he felt a tiny, stinging recoil. She was not a potential guest. She was a potential examiner. And as she packed her equipment, promising to return with more sensitive devices, the king knew a new phase had begun. The dance was no longer just about consumption. It was now about exposure. And he was no longer just a malevolent king on a throne of nightmares. He was a specimen, pinned under the lens of a relentless, curious world. Story 2. The thought arrived in Katie S.'s mind not as a memory, but as a stain. It was the vivid, unwelcome image of carving a pumpkin with her father decades ago. The slick, cold pulp of its innards clinging to her small fingers. But it was wrong. The pumpkin she saw in her mind, I wasn't he the cheerful, lopsided grin of childhood. Its carved smile was a rictus of pain, and the candle inside guttered not with warm light, but with a sickly, greenish flame that threw the shadows of the seeds, like a swarm of black insects dancing up the kitchen walls. She could smell it, the waxy smoke and the vegetal rot, a scent that had no place in the sterile, recycled air of the campaign bus. She blinked, and the memory was gone, leaving only a cold residue in her veins. Outside the bus window, America rolled by, a tableau of enforced normalcy painted in the colors of decay. It was October 28th. The world was dead, but Halloween, it seemed, was immortal. The restoration, they called it. A cordon sanitaire of concrete and steel, separating the living zones from the vast, silent territories of the infected the echoes, as the government had rebranded them with chilling PR gentility. Society had clawed its way back to a fragile, paranoid simulacrum of before, all under the watchful eye of the unified authority. And truth, the new most precious commodity, was disseminated by people like Katie and her brother Howard. They were bloggers, journalists, storytellers, the ones who ventured into the controlled chaos to report the human cost. Their current assignment was following the campaign of Governor Creed, the man who promised not just to maintain the walls, but to expand them, to reclaim the night. He was a tall man, Creed, with a voice that felt like warm syrup and eyes that never quite held yours. He spoke of hope, of a brighter future, all while standing before banners of black and orange, the colors of the season, the colors of warning. Howard nudged her, his face illuminated by the glow of his tablet. You spaced out. You get the shot of the harvest moon over the quarantine zone. It's practically gothic. Katie nodded, lifting her camera. The moon was indeed enormous, a jaundiced orange ball hanging low in the twilight, its light catching the razor wire in silver streaks. It looked like a great, unblinking eye. It's something, she murmured. The bus was heading to a town called Harvest S. End, a place famous in the before times for its Halloween festival. Creed was holding a massive rally there on the 31st, a symbol, his speechwriters said, of taking back our traditions, of showing the dark that we are not afraid. But Katie was afraid. The false memory of the pumpkin was just the latest in a series of psychic static. Lately, the line between her thoughts and something else felt thin, porous. They arrived in Harvest S End as a deep October cold was settling into the bones of the town. The place was a masterpiece of macabre decoration. Every porch was a shrine to the season. Jack-o'-lanterns with twisted, leering faces stood sentinel. Synthetic cobwebs draped eaves and mailboxes, bejeweled with morning dew that looked like real diamonds of frost. Plastic skeletons hung from trees, their limbs clicking in the wind like bony chimes. But in this new world, the decorations carried a darker weight. Were those real bones woven into the display next door? Was that a trick of the light? Or did the scarecrow in the cornfield at the edge of town just turn its burlap head? Their hotel was a historic inn, all creaking floorboards and floral wallpaper that smelled of dust and ancient wood smoke. That night, Katie dreamed. She was a child trick-or-treating. She walked down a familiar street, her costume a cheap witch-esque cloak, the plastic mask making her breath hot and moist. But the other children were wrong. Their costumes were too good, their movements too fluid, their laughter a hollow, echoing sound that had no joy in it. They moved through the twilight, a procession of tiny monsters, and at each door they were not given candy, but something dark and glistening that they consumed with a terrible, single-minded hunger. She looked into her own treat bag. It was full of teeth. She woke with a gasp, the coppery taste of fear on her tongue. The digital clock read 3:03 a.m. From the town square, she could hear the distant, rhythmic rustle of the dead corn stalks in the community maze, a sound like 1,000 whispering voices. The next day, October 29th, was for investigation. While Howard dug into the town's digital records, Katie walked the streets, her camera a shield. The air was thick with the conflicting smells of the season, the sweet, cloying scent of candy corn and caramel apples from open bakery doors, and beneath it, the faint, persistent odor of rotting vegetation and wet earth. The townspeople were friendly, but their eyes were guarded. They spoke of Creed with a fervor that bordered on zealotry. They were proud of their festival, a tradition they were determined to keep alive. Even now, the veil is thin here, an old woman told her, her gnarled hands arranging a display of vintage cardboard skeletons in her shop window. Her eyes, milky with cataracts, seemed to look right through Katie. Always has been. Samhain night, the dead walk. And not just your echoes out there. The older dead, the hungry ones. Creed knows. He understands the old ways. Katie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She bought a small, black candle from the woman, a pointless, superstitious gesture. Back at the inn, Howard had found something. His face was pale. Katie, look at this. He pulled up satellite imagery of the region, the rally site. It's not just the town square. Look at the topography. The main stage is positioned at the center of a natural bowl, with the corn maze and the old cemetery forming the eastern and western edges. And these access roads he zoomed in. They ray not for crowd control. They ray conduits. They lead straight from the stage area out to the edge of the quarantine zone. What are you saying? I am saying this isn't just a rally, Howard whispered, his voice tight. It's a ritual. Creed S not just giving a speech on Halloween. He performing a ceremony. Look at his donor lists. Half of them are shell corporations, but the ones I can trace they rate biomedical research firms. The same ones that were working on the original virus. The conspiracy unfolded like a poisoned flower. Creed and his hidden backers hadn't just managed the aftermath of the outbreak. They had orchestrated a key part of it. The echoes were not a tragic accident to be contained. They were a resource. A controllable, predictable population of the dead, kept in reserve. And the expanded living zones Creed promised. They weren't for the living. They were pens. The media, including them, were there not to report the truth, but to broadcast the spectacle, to spread the specific, curated fear that would make the populace compliant, that would make them cheer for their own gilded cage. That evening, the town held a pre-festival party in the old community hall. Katie and Howard went, their minds reeling. The hall was a fever dream of Halloween. People danced in elaborate costumes, their faces hidden behind masks of monsters and celebrities, their identities erased. The air was thick with fog from a machine, mingling with the real October mist that crept through the door each time it opened. A bowl of candy apples sat on a table, their glossy red surfaces reflecting the strobe lights, making them look like freshly harvested organs. Katie saw Creed across the room holding court. He was dressed as a classical orator, a toga over his suit. He caught her eye and smiled, a slow, knowing smile. He raised a glass of dark liquid in a toast to her. In that moment, she felt the foreign memory push at the edges of her mind again. This time, it was the sensation of a mask, not on her face, but fused to it, the weight of it permanent, the identity beneath forgotten. She stumbled outside, into the cold, needing air. The night was alive. The jack-o'-lanterns on every porch seemed to watch her pass, their flickering grins mocking. The wind through the bare branches of the oaks sounded like claws scraping on slate. She found herself at the entrance to the corn maze, the towering, dried stalks rustling their dry, papery language. She heard a child's laughter from within, but it was cut short, replaced by a wet, guttural sound she knew all too well from her time near the walls. Howard found her there, shivering. We have to get out of here. We have to broadcast this. The LL never let us, Katie said, her voice hollow. The signal is probably already jammed. We rate part of the decoration, Howard. Part of the show. On October 30th, the dread was a physical presence, a cold hand on the back of the neck. The town was preparing for its grand celebration with a frantic, desperate energy. The smell of burning leaves from countless pyres filled the air, the smoke a gray shroud over the orange-tinted sky. Katie and Howard tried to contact their editor, but the lines were dead. They tried to leave, but their bus had been quarantined due to a fictional mechanical issue. They were trapped in Harvest S End, guests of honor at a feast they wanted no part of. That night, Katie sat on her bed, the black candle from the old woman S shop in her hand. On a whim, she lit it. The flame was not the warm yellow of a normal candle, but a deep, smoky orange, the color of the harvest moon. It cast long, dancing shadows that did not behave as they should. They pooled in the corners of the room, thick and liquid. And for a moment, she saw shapes in them, the hunched form of a scarecrow, the skittering gait of something with too many legs, the patient, standing silhouette of an echo. The veil was thinning. The holiday, the ancient, powerful force of Samhain, was not just a backdrop. It was a catalyst. Creed and his conspirators weren't just using the date for symbolism. They were tapping into a genuine liminal energy, a night when the walls between worlds were tissue paper thin. Their virus, their technology, was just a key turning in an ancient, waiting lock. Halloween morning dawned cold and bright, the sun a pale, weak coin in a hard, blue sky. By afternoon, the crowds began to gather for the rally. They came in costumes, a sea of monsters and heroes, their faces hidden, their individual wills submerged in the collective. The atmosphere was electric, a volatile mix of festival excitement and primal fear. Katie and Howard moved through them, their press passes feeling like targets. As dusk began to bleed the color from the world, the rally began. Creed took the stage, bathed in a spotlight that made him look like a messiah. His voice boomed from the speakers, talking of unity, of strength, of a new dawn. But Katie heard the other words, the ones woven between the lines, the invocations. He spoke of reaping what we have sown, of offering to the old gods of the earth, of a great thinning. Then, as the last sliver of sun vanished, and true night fell on October 31st, he gave the signal. The lights on the stage died. For a heart-stopping moment, there was utter blackness and silence. Then, a single, massive jack-o'-lantern at the center of the stage ignited. Its flame, that same sickly green from Katie S. false memory. A low hum began to emanate from the speakers, a frequency that vibrated in the teeth and bones of everyone present, and the changes began. At the edges of the crowd, near the access roads Howard had found, the screams started. Not the playful shrieks of frightened teenagers, but the raw, terror-filled sounds of people seeing the impossible. The echoes were coming, not shambling, confused wrecks as they were near the walls, but a directed, purposeful horde, flowing into the town square from the opened conduits. But they were different. Their movements were synchronized, their empty eyes fixed on the stage. They were herded, a tide of the dead. But the true horror was within the crowd itself. A woman in a cat costume shrieked, not in fear, but in agony, as the whiskers drawn on her face seemed to burrow into her skin, her features shifting, contorting. A man dressed as a wolf dropped to all fours, his plastic fangs elongating into yellowed bone, a guttural snarl tearing from his throat. The costumes were not just costumes anymore. The masks were not coming off. The liminality of the night, amplified by Creed-S technology, was making the imagined real. The playing at monsters was becoming being monsters. The crowd dissolved into a chaos of transformation and slaughter. The orange and black colors of the festival were now the colors of blood and night. The sweet smell of candy was overwhelmed by the metallic tang of it. Katie and Howard fought their way toward the stage, a desperate, futile plan to stop the signal, to break whatever transmission was enabling this. Howard, ever loyal, ever brave, shoved her behind a concession stand as a group of transformed revelers' things that were now part costume, part flesh loped past. The candle, he gasped, his eyes wide with a fear she had never seen in him before. The old woman-S candle. It S a focus, Katie. It shows you what S real. Then he was gone, pulled into the swirling, shrieking mass by a creature that had once been a man in a scarecrow outfit. Its burlap face, now a screaming, living thing. Katie ran. She fled the town square, the sounds of the apocalypse ringing in her ears. She found herself in the old cemetery, the one that formed the western edge of the ritual site. The ground was soft and cold. The hum from the square was weaker here, but the thinness of the veil was palpable. She could see phantoms, older ghosts, drawn by the energy, watching the modern carnage with ancient, indifferent eyes. She fell to her knees, the black candle clutched in her hand. She was sobbing, her brother gone, the world ending to the soundtrack of a perverted holiday. She fumbled for a lighter, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She lit the wick. The orange flame bloomed, and for a moment, it showed her the truth. The cemetery was not a resting place, but a wound. The ghosts were not passive observers, they were feeding. And the ritual in the town square was not just about controlling the echoes. It was about opening a permanent door, making every night Halloween, making the masquerade eternal. Creed wasn't he a savior. He was a high priest offering his entire species as a sacrament. The flame flickered, and in its dying light, she saw Howard-S. face, not in terror, but with a placid, empty calm. He was one of them now, wearing a mask that was his own face, but no longer his. The candle went out. The sounds from the town square began to change. The screams lessened. The snarls and howls subsided. A new sound took their place, the rustle of footsteps, the low, murmured chatter of a crowd. A normal crowd. Katie crept to the edge of the cemetery and looked back. The town square was illuminated again with warm, ordinary light. People were milling about, laughing, their costumes once again just costumes. The stage was empty. It was as if the last hour of hell had never happened. But she knew. She could see it in the too perfect way they moved, in the hollow cheer in their laughter, in the way their eyes reflected the light like polished glass. The transformation was complete, and it was seamless. The conspiracy had won. They had not destroyed humanity. They had simply changed it. They had reaped the harvest they had sown, and this was the new crop. The world had put on a mask, and it would never take it off. Katie stumbled back into the darkness of the cemetery, completely alone. The ancient fear of Halloween, the fear of the thing that looks back at you from the darkness with your own face, had become the air she breathed. Days later, or perhaps weeks' time, had lost its meaning. A cleanup crew, dressed in the orange and black uniforms of the Unified Authority, swept through the cemetery. They found nothing of note, just bones, old and new, and the detritus of a forgotten festival. One of them, a young man with a vacant, pleasant smile, kicked at a small, black lump of wax stuck to a tombstone. It was all that remained of the candle. He scraped it off with his boot, leaving no trace at all. The object was gone, and with it, the last flicker of the world that was. Everything had reduced to this single, symbolic point. Nothing. A perfect, seamless, and endless Halloween night she walked. There was no other thought, no other purpose. Her legs carried her away from the cemetery, away from the town, following the paths of the dead that only she could now perceive. The roads out of Harvest's End were open, unguarded. Why guard a prison when the inmates no longer remember the sky? She hitched a ride with a family in a station wagon, their faces painted with the benign smiles of mannequins. They offered her candy from a wicker basket. She declined, staring out the window at a world that looked, on the surface, serene. The cities were the same. The lights were on. People went to work. The news channels broadcast soothing reports of unity and progress under the new Unified Authority. The echoes were declared officially contained, a problem of the past. But Katie saw the truth flickering at the edges of her vision, a silent film projected over reality. The businessman briskly walking down the street had the faint, shimmering outline of a reptile's snout. The woman laughing in the cafe had an extra set of arms folded neatly behind her back, visible only when the light hit the air around her just so. They were all wearing their costumes, their true faces now, and they had forgotten they were wearing them. She found a room in a decaying apartment building on the fringe of what was once the quarantine zone. The other residents were the left behind, the ones whose transformation had been incomplete or flawed. An old man who whispered to the flies on his wall. A woman who only moved when you weren't looking directly at her. They were the ghosts in the new machine, and they did not question her presence. Here, her own fractured perception was normal. Her camera was her only tool. She took pictures of the new world, but the images that developed were lies. They showed normal streets, normal people. The film, or the world itself, was complicit in the cover-up. One day, she pointed it at a mirror. The photograph showed a young woman with tired eyes, but in the reflection itself, just for a second, she had seen a different face, pale, drawn, with eyes that were too dark. A face that was slowly becoming a mask of grief and terror. She ventured out only for food, scrounging from abandoned stores. On one of these trips, she saw a poster for Creed. His face was everywhere beatific, calm. The text beneath it read, "The harvest is secure." It was not a political slogan. It was a statement of fact. In her room, surrounded by the silent evidence of her useless photographs, a final, terrible memory surfaced. It was not a false one. It was from her childhood, a true memory she had buried. She was 6, trick-or-treating. She had gotten separated from her parents. In a moment of panic, she had wished, with all her might, that she could just put on a mask and become someone else, someone who wasn't scared. And for a few seconds, standing alone under a flickering street lamp, she felt her face go numb and still, like plastic. The feeling had passed, but the potential had always been there, sleeping inside her, waiting for a night when the veil was not just thin, but torn asunder. That was the final, crushing understanding. Creed-S ritual hadn't he created this. It had simply awakened a latent potential in everyone, a psychic surrender to the archetype, the persona, the monster. He had given them permission to put on the mask and forget they had done so. And she, with her fragile, porous mind, had been feeling the edges of that truth her whole life. She had no mission left. Howard was gone. The truth was now the wallpaper of the world, invisible to those who lived within it. One evening, she sat on the floor of her room as the sun set, casting the room in a familiar, jaundiced orange glow. The silence was absolute. She felt the pull, the seductive whisper of the new order, to just let go, to stop fighting the static, to choose a mask, the brave reporter, the lost sister, the lonely survivor, and let it fuse to her soul. It would be so much easier. From the street below, she heard the sound of children playing. Their laughter was perfect, melodic, and utterly empty. It was the sound of the world to come. Katie closed her eyes and listened, waiting to see which part of her would give up first. The fight was over. Now, there was only the long, quiet wait for the mask to settle, and for her own private Halloween to become forever. The laughter from the street began to change. It didn't grow louder or softer, but the pitch shifted, warping from the hollow cheer of children into something lower, more guttural. It was the same wet, choking sound she had heard from the corn maze. Her eyes snapped open. The room was darker now, the orange light from the window deepening to a bloody crimson. The shadows in the corners of her room were no longer just an absence of light. They had texture, a velvety, breathing density. She knew then that giving up was not an option. The surrender she contemplated was not an escape into peace, but a direct invitation. The thing that had taken the world was not a single entity, but a force, and it was hungry for the last few who could still see it. Her awareness was a flicker it sought to extinguish, not ignore. A soft scraping came from the other side of her apartment door. Not a knock. It was the sound of something dry and hard being dragged slowly across the cheap wood. She held her breath. The doorknob, tarnished brass, began to turn with a series of faint, metallic clicks. It was locked, but the mechanism groaned as if under immense pressure. Katie scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough floorboards. There was no weapon, no escape. The window led to a 5-story drop. The The scraping at the door stopped, and a new sound began, a low, rhythmic humming. It was the same frequency from the rally, the one that had vibrated in their bones. It was here for her. The lock snapped with a sound like a breaking bone. The door did not swing open. It simply drifted inward, and the thing from the hallway filled the frame. It was not an echo. It was the man from the apartment across the hall, the one who had always smiled with such vacant politeness. He still wore his delivery uniform, but his skin had taken on the mottled, waxy texture of a jack-o'-lantern. His eyes were gone, replaced by 2 flickering points of that same sickly green light. His smile was fixed and wide, carved into his face. In one hand, he held a wicker basket. It was not full of candy. The humming was coming from him. He took a step into the room, his movements stiff, like a puppet on strings. Katie pressed herself against the wall, the rough plaster catching on her shirt. This was it. This was how the last flicker of the old world was collected and snuffed out. Her hand, trembling, brushed against something small and hard in her pocket. A single, unused film cartridge. It was nothing. A useless token. As the thing that was once her neighbor reached for her with its free hand, its fingers elongating into sharp, woody talons, she did the only thing she could think to do. She threw it. The small plastic cylinder bounced harmlessly off the creature's chest. It did not stop. It did not even flinch. But the act of throwing it, this last, futile gesture of defiance, shifted her weight. Her other hand, splayed on the floor behind her, pressed down on a splinter of wood. The pain was sharp and clean. A pinprick of pure, real sensation in a world of suffocating nightmare. It was a feeling that belonged only to her, unfiltered, unmanipulated. For a single, crystalline second, the humming stopped. The green light in the thing's eyes flickered. It was not a weakness. It was a clue. As the taloned hand closed around her arm, its touch like cold, rough vine, she did not pull away. Instead, she focused on the pain in her hand, on the warm, real welling of blood. She leaned into the memory of the splinter, of the true, physical world it represented. She thought of the cold of the cemetery ground, the real ache in her muscles from running, the taste of real fear in her mouth, not this curated horror. The thing holding her hesitated. Its carved smile seemed to waver. The green light in its eyes dimmed, and for a horrific instant, she saw the man's real eyes behind them, wide with a terror far greater than her own. He was still in there, trapped behind the mask of his own transformed self. Then the green light flared back, brighter than before. The humming resumed, louder, angrier. The talons tightened, and she felt a dreadful numbness spread up her arm. It was not pain, but an erasure. The thing raised its basket, but Katie was no longer looking at it. She was looking past it, at the dark, breathing shadows in the corner of her room. And for the first time, she did not see them as a threat. She saw them as a door. The veil was still thin here, in this place of the left behind. The ritual had opened a permanent door for them, but perhaps it worked both ways. She stopped fighting the static in her mind. Instead, she reached for it, not to surrender herself, but to channel it. She focused on the memory of the black candle's flame, on the way it had shown her the wounds in the world. She poured every ounce of her will, every sharp, real memory of pain and love and loss, into a single, silent command. She did not ask for salvation. She asked for a witness. The shadows in the corner convulsed. They did not form a shape, but a presence. An ancient, cold attention focused on the room, on her, on the thing holding her. The humming from her neighbor cut off into a strangled gasp. The green light in his eyes winked out. The talons around her arm crumbled into dry, fibrous dust. The wicker basket fell to the floor. Its contents, a collection of small, pale bones scattering across the floorboards. The thing that had been her neighbor stood frozen for a moment, a statue of withered flesh and carved pumpkin. Then it collapsed inward upon itself, dissolving into a pile of rot and dried gored flesh, smelling of spoiled fruit and damp earth. The presence in the shadows remained. Katie could feel it watching her, an intelligence as old as fear itself. It had not come to save her. It had come because her raw, unfiltered terror was a beacon, a delicious morsel in a world that was now being served bland, processed horror. She had not broken the rules of the new world. She had simply reminded an older one that a more potent flavor existed. She sat there, cradling her numb arm, staring at the pile of decay that had almost been her end. The victory was empty. She had not found a weapon. She had merely proven she was still prey, just to a different, more particular hunter. The world was still masked, but she had learned something. The real world, the world of pain and splinters and true memories, was the one thing the new order could not perfectly mimic. It was her anchor, and it was also the only thing that could draw the attention of the things that even Creed, in his arrogance, had not known were watching. Her survival would be a balancing act on a razor's edge, a dance between two kinds of annihilation. She picked herself up off the floor. The long wait was over. Now, the hunt was beginning. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the humming. It was a listening silence. The presence in the corner had not departed. It had simply withdrawn, sated for the moment by the fear it had consumed. Katie knew it would be back. Her value was her suffering, and to stop suffering was to become irrelevant, to become one of the smiling people in the street. She had to move. The commotion, though silent to the outside world, had been a beacon. She wrapped her numb arm in a strip of cloth torn from her bedding, the sensation of the rough fabric, a welcome anchor. She did not look at the scattered bones on the floor. She packed nothing, because she owned nothing of value except the clothes on her back and the knowledge in her head. She slipped out of the apartment building, moving through the halls like a ghost herself. The other flawed residents were hiding, their doors shut tight, their presence behind them a muted thrum of wrongness. They had felt what had happened. They They knew a new power had stirred in their midst. The city at night was a diorama of normalcy. Streetlights cast perfect pools of light. A couple walked hand in hand, their laughter a synchronized, tinny sound. But Katie kept her focus on the small, real things, the ache in her feet, the chill of the night air biting through her jacket, the persistent, throbbing memory of the splinter in her hand. With every step, she reinforced her own reality, building a fragile shell of self against the pervasive fiction. She walked for hours, until the manicured city center gave way to industrial decay. She found a derelict factory, its windows shattered, its interior a cavern of rust and shadows. It was a place of true ruin, not the curated decay the unified authority allowed to exist as a reminder of the old world's failures. Here, the air smelled of iron oxide and stagnant water. Here, the shadows felt ordinary again. In the absolute dark of a gutted office, she finally allowed herself to rest. She leaned against a cold metal wall, sliding down to sit on the concrete floor. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was terrifyingly clear. The plan that formed was not one of resistance, but of propagation. She could not fight the mask, but she could remind the world of the face beneath it. And she knew now that there were older, hungrier things that preferred the taste of real faces. Her camera was useless for recording, but it was a tool nonetheless, a symbol, a focus for her own intent. She held its cold, metal body in her hands. She would not take pictures of the world as it was. She would use it to create moments of dissonance, to prick the seamless skin of the new reality. She would be a splinter in the world's finger. A scuffling sound came from the hallway outside. Not the deliberate, predatory step of the thing from her apartment, but something hesitant, furtive. Katie froze, her senses straining. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the slightly less dark hallway. It was small, hunched over. "Are you real?" a voice whispered, cracked and dry. Katie didn't answer. She just watched. The figure took a shuffling step forward. "I felt it when you called, the other thing. I felt the crack." It was a woman, her face lined with grime and a deep, unhealed terror. Her eyes were wide, darting, but they were human eyes. They held a spark the smiling people had lost. "I'm not one of them," the woman said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Not all the way. It didn't take. It hurts." She clutched at her own chest. "It always hurts." Katie understood. This woman was like her, a flawed transformation. But where Katie's mind had been the flaw, this woman's was a physical or emotional pain so great it had resisted the final, peaceful fusion. Her constant suffering was her anchor. "There are others," the woman whispered, creeping closer. "A few we hide. We feel the cracks when they happen. We felt you." Katie looked at this broken, suffering woman, and she saw not a companion, but a tool, a resource, a spark that could be used to start a fire. She felt no pity, only a cold, calculating purpose. The hunt was indeed beginning, but she was not just the prey. She was the bait and the hunter all at once. "Tell me," Katie said, her voice low and steady in the consuming dark. "Tell me where the others are." The woman, who called herself Mara, led Katie through a labyrinth of rust and collapsed ceilings. They moved in silence, their progress marked only by the scuff of their shoes and the distant, rhythmic drip of water. Mara's pain was a palpable thing, a low-grade hum of anguish that seemed to keep the oppressive, false cheer of the city at bay. Katie used it as a shield, focusing on the raw, jagged edges of the woman's presence to fortify her own. They descended into a sub-basement, through a hatch hidden under a pile of moldering burlap sacks. The air below was cold and still, smelling of wet earth and old metal. A single battery-powered lantern cast a wobbly circle of light on a small group of people huddled on the floor. There were 5 of them. A man with one side of his face frozen in a permanent, silent scream, the skin waxy and immobile. A teenage girl who compulsively scratched at her arms, leaving bloody tracks that seemed to heal almost as quickly as she made them. An older woman who held a silent, staring conversation with something only she could see. And 2 others who simply sat, their bodies present, but their spirits seemingly huddled somewhere deep inside, flinching from the world. These were the cracks, the ones who hadn't sealed properly. Their transformations were prisons, not liberations. They looked up as Katie entered, and for a moment, a flicker of something not hope, but a kind of desperate recognition passed between them. The one who made the noise, the man with the frozen face, said, his words slurred by his rigid cheek. "You called the deep thing." "I did," Katie said. Her voice was calm, alien to her own ears. She was no longer just Katie. She was the woman from the apartment, the one who had stared into the shadow and been seen in return. It answered. The girl stopped scratching. "Why didn't it take you?" "Because I'm more useful to it awake," Katie replied. The truth of the statement was a cold stone in her gut. My fear is a flavor. Your pain is a signal. We are all anchors to the real world, and that reality is the only thing that can disrupt the harvest. She knelt, placing her camera on the floor in the center of their group. It was no longer a tool for capturing lies. It was a totem. Greed gave everyone a mask to make them forget they had a face, she said, looking at each of them in turn. We are going to remind them. We are going to make them feel the splinters. Their plan was not one of bombs or bullets. It was a campaign of psychic dissonance. The girl, Alara, could bleed without end. Her blood, they discovered, when smeared on the pristine walls of the new city, would not be seen as blood by the masked people, but it would cause a glitch, a momentary shudder in their perception, a flash of inexplicable revulsion. The man, Aris, with his frozen face, could stand on a street corner and project his silent scream. Those who passed would feel a sudden, unaccountable chill, a fleeting sense of being trapped. Katie was the conductor. Using her own fractured perception, she could find the thin places, the spots where the new world's wallpaper was poorly applied. She would guide them there. And sometimes, when the dissonance was great enough, when the collective, real suffering they unleashed created a crack wide enough, she would focus her will and call into the shadows. She would offer a feast of true terror to the presence that watched. Days bled into nights. They became ghosts in the machine of the new world, leaving traces of reality like snail trails across a perfect facade. A businessman would suddenly vomit on his clean suit for no reason. A mother would feel a stab of primal fear for her child, a feeling the new world had smoothed away. These were small things, barely noticeable, but they accumulated like dust in the gears. One evening, standing on a roof overlooking a plaza where 1,000 people gathered for a mandatory unity reflection, Katie prepared their most audacious act. Below, the crowd was a sea of placid, upturned faces, bathed in the greenish light of a massive hologram of Creed. The humming was about to begin. Mara and Eris were positioned in the crowd, vessels of pure, unfiltered agony. Alara was near the base of the hologram projector, her arms freshly scored. Katie closed her eyes, blocking out the sight, and reached for the static in her mind. She reached for the memory of the splinter, the cold floor, the taste of her own blood. She gathered the psychic signatures of her companions Mara's chronic despair, Eris's trapped scream, Alara's self-inflicted pain, and braided them together into a single, sharp needle of reality. As Creed's image opened its mouth to speak, Katie threw the needle. The effect was not an explosion, but a rupture. The hologram of Creed flickered, and for a single, breathtaking second, his beatific face was replaced by the gaunt, feverish face of the man he had been, his eyes wide with a terror he could no longer consciously feel. The humming stuttered, becoming a discordant wail. In the plaza, a wave of nausea and confusion passed through the crowd. People stumbled, clutching their heads. The seamless unity shattered into 1,000 individual moments of disorientation. In that moment of collective fracture, Katie turned her will to the shadows between the buildings. She did not ask. She presented. She offered the entire plaza's sudden, real, unscripted fear. The air grew cold. The streetlights dimmed. A profound silence fell, deeper than any the unified authority could engineer. From the deepening shadows between two buildings, a shape began to coalesce. It was not the thing from her apartment. It was vaster, older. It had no form, only a crushing weight of attention, a hunger that had been waiting since long before humanity had thought to carve a pumpkin or wear a mask. It was not here for Creed. It was here for the harvest he had so carefully prepared. The real one. Katie watched from the roof, her own small pain a dull echo against the monumental presence now entering their world. The hunt had changed. She was no longer just the bait. She had become the herald. And the world was about to learn that some masks, once put on, attract predators from a much darker wood. The silence did not break. It was consumed. The presence did not roar or shriek. It simply was, a hole in the world through which an older darkness poured. The streetlights did not just dim, they died. Their artificial light swallowed whole. The hologram of Creed dissolved into static, and then into nothing, its signal annihilated by the sheer weight of the thing now occupying the plaza. Below, the unified crowd did not scream. The event was too vast, too alien for their curated emotions to process. They simply stood, a field of statues, their programmed serenity broken not by panic, but by a system failure. Their minds, smooth and polished, had no grooves to catch this. They were crashing. But the cracks, the flawed ones, they felt it. Mara fell to her knees, her chronic pain flaring into a white-hot beacon of sensation. Eris' frozen face contorted, a tear finally managing to escape his immobilized tear duct. Alara stopped scratching and just stared, her blood forgotten, her whole being riveted by the terrible majesty above them. Katie watched from the rooftop, the wind whipping her hair. She was a speck, an insect on the rim of a glass that was now being drunk from by a giant. She had not summoned a monster to fight a tyrant. She had pointed a gourmet to a farm. The unified authority had spent years tenderizing the human spirit, making it docile and palatable. They had not realized they were preparing a feast for a diner they could not comprehend. The presence began to feed. It did not move, but the people in the plaza did. One by one, then in small groups, they simply dissolved. Their bodies unraveled into motes of faint, greenish light that were then drawn upwards, siphoned into the waiting darkness between the buildings. There was no sound, no struggle. It was a harvest in its purest form. The energy of their lives, their subdued fears and managed joys, was being consumed like a fine wine. This was not the terror Katie had known. This was something else, a cosmic indifference that made Creed's malevolence seem petty and human. She had wanted to break the system, but she was watching the universe itself press the delete key. A figure emerged onto the rooftop behind her. The air around him shimmered, a personal bubble of stability against the consuming void. It was Creed, not a hologram, but the man himself. His face was no longer a mask of benevolent authority. It was tight with a fury, so profound it had burned away all pretense. His eyes, a piercing, angry blue, fixed on her. "You," he hissed, the word carrying over the unnatural silence. "You little flaw. You think UV won. UV just poisoned the well." Katie turned to face him, her body thrumming with a strange, detached calm. The splinter in her hand ached, a tiny, real point in a universe gone mad. "I didn't poison it," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet perfectly clear. "I just told the owner what you were doing with his property." He took a step forward, his form flickering for a moment as the entity below fed. He was fighting it, using his own immense will to maintain his cohesion. "I was saving them. I was giving them peace, order. You were farming them," Katie said. "And you forgot that anything you can farm, something else can hunt." A wave of distortion passed through him. He cried out, a raw, human sound of pain and effort as he fought against the draw of the presence. He was the architect of this new world, the most concentrated source of its energy. He was the prime target. It will take everything. He snarled, staggering. You included. Maybe, Katie replied. She looked past him, down at the plaza. Half the crowd was gone now, the rest standing in vacant, doomed silence. She saw Mara look up at her, a final, clear look of understanding passing between them before Mara, too, dissolved into light and was gone. Their pain was over. Katie looked back at Creed. But I am real, and it is hungry for what is real. You rate just a concept, and concepts are the first thing to go, with a final, agonized scream that was torn away into silence. Creed's form unraveled. The green light of his being was brighter than the others, a brilliant, sickly star before it was extinguished, drawn up into the darkness. Katie was alone on the roof. The presence was still there, sated for now, but waiting. The city was a ghost town, a hollowed-out shell. The humming was gone. The masks were gone. All that was left was the quiet, the dark, and the cold. She walked to the edge of the roof and looked down at the empty plaza. The hunt was over. The predator had consumed the prey and the farmer and the field. She was the only one left, a splinter of the real world in a universe that had just been scoured clean. She wasn't a herald anymore. She was a relic. And as she felt the ancient, cold attention slowly, inevitably, turned towards her, she understood her final role. She was the last course she did not run. There was nowhere to go that it could not find her. The air grew thick and cold, pressing in on her from all sides. It was not a physical pressure, but a mental one, a weight of attention that sought to flatten her into just another piece of data, another flavor of energy to be consumed. Katie closed her eyes. She let go of the plan, the purpose, the cold calculation. She let go of the memory of the apartment, of Creed's furious face, of Mara's pain. She dug deeper, past the recent horrors, into the silt of a life lived before the world had gone smooth. She found the smell of rain on hot pavement, the feeling of grass under her bare feet, the taste of a strawberry, so sweet it made her teeth ache, the sound of her mother singing, off-key and happy, in another room, the sting of a scraped knee, the warmth of a hand held in hers. These were not grand things. They were small, flawed, and utterly real. They were hers. The presence hovered around her, tasting the edges of her being. It was considering her. She was an anomaly, a morsel of unexpected complexity. She was not the bland piece of the unified, nor the sharp, simple agony of the cracks. She was a full spectrum, a lifetime of tiny, authentic moments. She opened her eyes and looked directly into the heart of the darkness. She did not project defiance or fear. She simply was. She held up her hand, the one with the nearly forgotten splinter, and she focused on the tiny, persistent throb of it. A real injury, a real body. The presence did not withdraw. It did not advance. It simply shifted. The crushing weight of its attention lessened, not in dismissal, but in a kind of acknowledgement. It was like a diner savoring the last, most interesting bite of a meal, deciding not to swallow it immediately. Then it was gone. The silence it left behind was different. It was not the manufactured silence of the unified authority, nor the consuming silence of the entity. It was the ordinary, empty silence of a place with no people. The wind picked up, whistling through the empty plaza below, carrying dust and forgotten leaflets. A real wind. Katie stood on the roof, utterly alone. The city was a graveyard of a future that had lasted for barely a moment. The lights were out. The lies were over. She was cold and tired and alive. She walked down through the silent building and out into the street. She stepped over a discarded uniform, empty and crisp. There were no bodies, just absence. She did not know what would come next. Other cities, other countries, might still be under the unified authority, or they might have already fallen to other hungers. The world was broken open now, its careful order ripped away. It was a terrifying thought. It was also, for the first time in years, a true one. Katie adjusted the strap of her useless camera on her shoulder. She picked a direction at random and started to walk. She was not a herald or a hunter or a relic. She was a woman with a splinter in her hand, walking through the ruins of a lie. The world was real again, in all its terrible, uncertain beauty. And she was going to go and see it. The road out of the city was a river of discarded masks, each one a pale, empty shell. She walked for miles, the only sound the scuff of her shoes, and the lonely cry of a bird that had somehow survived, its song a sharp, real thing in the quiet. The further she got, the more the world began to bleed back in. The artificial green tint to the air faded, replaced by the true gold of a setting sun. Weeds pushed through cracks in the highway, and the scent of pine began to overtake the smell of ozone and decay. She found a small, abandoned house at the edge of a forgotten wood. The door was unlocked. Inside, dust motes danced in the slanted light, and a calendar on the wall was frozen on a month from the old world. It was a tomb, but a peaceful one. For days, she did little but sleep and eat from cans of food she found in the pantry. The silence was immense, but it was no longer predatory. It was just silence. She would sit on the porch and watch the trees, feeling the splinter in her hand, a tiny, persistent anchor to her own physical self. One morning, she saw a figure emerging from the tree line. A man moving slowly, cautiously. He was gaunt, his clothes patched and worn, and he carried an old rifle. He saw her and froze, his eyes wide with a wariness she understood. He was not unified. He was real. He called out, his voice rough from disuse. "You're from the city." Katie stood, keeping her hands visible. "I was." He lowered the rifle a fraction. We heard something, a silence that hurt the ears. Then the broadcasts from the other zones just stopped. "There's nothing left to broadcast from," Katie said. "It's gone." The man, whose name was Leo, took her to his community. They were a handful of survivors living in the woods, people who had either escaped the initial unification or had been too remote to be caught in its net. They were scared, hardened, and free. They listened to her story with a kind of terrified awe. They saw her not as a savior or a destroyer, but as a storm that had passed, leaving a changed world in its wake. Weeks turned into months. The community grew slowly as other stragglers found their way out of the dead zones. Katie helped where she could, but she always felt separate, a piece of a different, darker puzzle. She still had her camera. One day, on a whim, she took it apart, using the tiny, precise lens to focus a beam of sunlight onto a dry leaf until it smoldered. It was a tool again, but for a new purpose. Leo found her watching the small curl of smoke. "You know," he said quietly, "we can't just hide in the woods forever. We have to see what's left. We have to try and build something." Katie nodded, her eyes on the horizon where the dead city lay. The entity was still out there, a fact of the universe now, like gravity or death. It had not been destroyed, only sated. It would be hungry again. "We will," she said, her voice firm. "But we build it knowing what's in the dark. We don't put up masks and pretend it isn't there. We build with real wood, and we keep a fire burning." She looked at her hands, one still marked by the tiny, healed-over splinter. "We remember the splinters. The work would be hard, the world vast and empty, and full of unknown dangers." But as she stood there, feeling the real sun on her face and hearing the real sounds of the forest, Katie knew it was a world worth walking in. The hunt was over. The long, slow work of living had begun. Story 3. The first chill came on October 28th, a private winter in the corner of Graham S. Loft. It was not the crisp, wholesome cold of the approaching season that smelled of wood smoke and apples, but a damp, invasive cold that clung to the air around a single object. He was showing off the portrait to Justin, preening in the late afternoon light that slanted through the massive windows, painting the floorboards in tones of antique gold. The city below, draped in orange and black bunting for the festivities, seemed a distant, cheerful dream. "It's perfection, Gray," Justin said, his voice a low purr of approval. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes, dark and knowing, fixed not on Graham S. face, but on the painting. Lyndon has captured that divine emptiness. It's flawless. Graham smiled, the expression he practiced in the mirror, a flash of white teeth and calculated charm. He stood before the canvas, a twin to the image rendered in oils. The same sun-kissed hair, the same clear, untroubled blue eyes, the same strong jawline that spoke of good breeding and better luck. The portrait was a celebration of his 25 years, a monument to his beauty, commissioned by himself, for himself. It was to be a bulwark against time. That's the idea, Graham said, to stay this way. Forever. Justin gestured with his glass toward the painting. Forever is a long time to be good. Beauty isn't a virtue, Gray. It's a currency. And like all currency, It meant to be spent. He took a slow sip. Indulgence, the real preservation. Let the world wear its scars. You enjoy the feast. It was then that Graham felt it. He reached out to trace the gilded edge of the frame, and his fingers brushed the canvas. A wave of cold, so profound and localized it felt like touching the surface of a frozen lake in mid-July, radiated from the portrait. He snatched his hand back. "What is it?" Justin asked, noting the flicker in Graham's practiced composure. "Nothing," Graham said, forcing a laugh. "A draft. This old building is full of them." But his eyes lingered on the painted ones of his doppelganger. For a moment, he thought he saw the painted lips twitch, not into a smile, but into something thinner, more weary. He dismissed it. It was Halloween week. The city was a theater of the strange, a sanctioned madness. Of course, his imagination was playing tricks. That night, he went to a costume party in a penthouse overlooking the park. He went as himself, which was all the costume anyone ever needed. He drank champagne that tasted like betrayal and whispered cruel jokes about the other guests into Justin's ear. He left with a woman whose name he forgot by morning. And when he returned to his loft, as the sun was rising, blood orange and immense behind the skyscrapers, the portrait waited. The jack-o'-lantern he deplaced on the mantelpiece earlier in the week, a lopsided, grinning thing, had been carved with a candle inside. Its light, a wavering, pumpkin-colored smear, danced across the painting's surface. In that unstable glow, the face in the portrait seemed older, not aged, but tired. A faint, shadowy suggestion of a line had appeared at the corner of the perfect mouth. Graham told himself it was the light, the alcohol, the strange mood of the season. He pulled the blinds shut and went to sleep. October 29th brought Hugh and Lindsay. Hugh, solid and dependable as an oak tree, frowned at the new opulence of the loft, the empty bottles, the ashtray full of lipstick-stained cigarettes, that wherein Lindsay carried a basket of autumn produce, small, lumpy pumpkins, Indian corn, a jar of apple butter. She was the last remnant of a simpler life, a life of college debates and shared pizzas and honest affection. Her love for Graham was a quiet, steady flame next to the bonfire of his vanity. "You're different, Gray," Hugh said, his voice low so Lindsay wouldn't hear from where she was arranging the corn on the kitchen counter. "This place, Justin, it's not you." "People change, Hugh," Graham said, his gaze drifting past his friend to the portrait. He covered it with a black silk cloth, the kind used for seances. It felt appropriate. "Not this fast," Hugh insisted. "Not for the worse. Remember when we used to love this time of year? We'd take Lindsay's little brother trick-or-treating. It was fun. It was innocent. Innocence is just ignorance with better publicity." Graham quoted, a line he learned from Justin. Hugh's face fell. Lindsay approached, her smile not quite reaching her worried eyes. "We brought you a pumpkin to carve," she said, holding up a perfect, plump one. For old time's sake, we can roast the seeds with salt, like we used to. Graham looked at the pumpkin, its potential for a ghoulish grin, and felt a surge of revulsion. The thought of scooping out the wet, stringy innards, the slimy seeds clinging to his fingers, made his stomach turn. "I am busy," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. "I have a party tonight." Lindsay flinched as if struck. The hope in her eyes guttered out. Hugh put a protective arm around her. "Come on, Linz," he said softly. "Let us go." After they left, the loft felt larger and emptier. The silence was broken only by the distant, happy shrieks of children playing in the leaf-strewn streets below. Graham stood before the covered portrait. The cold was a presence now, a sphere of winter centered on the canvas. He could feel it from 3 feet away. He yanked the cloth away. The change was undeniable. The face in the painting was still his, but it was a Graham who had stayed up for 3 days straight. A faint bluish shadow tinged the jawline. The eyes, once the color of a summer sky, now held a murky, greenish cast, like a stagnant pond. The lips were fuller, crueler. And there, on the left temple, was a single, livid pimple, rendered in excruciating, oily detail. A scream built in Graham's throat, but he choked it down. This was impossible. It was a trick. Justin was playing a prank, had hired someone to alter the painting. He called Justin, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. Justin arrived just as the streetlights flickered on, casting the world in a sickly orange sodium glow. He listened to Graham's frantic accusations, then studied the portrait, his expression not of shock, but of profound, unholy interest. Fascinating, he breathed, stepping closer, ignoring the chill. "You see, you are transferring the burden. All those late nights, the cheap champagne, the spiteful words, they have to go somewhere. The body is weak, gray, it shows wear and tear. But art is a vessel. It can hold so much more." He turned to Graham, his eyes gleaming. "Dante, you see the gift. You can have it all. Every indulgence, every sin. You can remain the golden boy while your portrait pays the price. It is the ultimate deal. It is a curse," Graham whispered, his eyes locked on the painted blemish. "Only if you ray afraid to look," Justin said. "Embrace it. See how far it can go." Halloween Eve, October 30th. The city was a riot of anticipation. Fake cobwebs clung to every lamppost, and the grinning faces of jack-o'-lanterns watched from every stoop. Graham, emboldened by Justin's twisted philosophy and a handful of pills, descended deeper. He was cruel to a waiter at lunch, reducing the young man to stuttering humiliation over a minor error. He stood by and laughed, while Justin verbally eviscerated a former friend. He stole a small, valuable trinket from a shop, not because he wanted it, but simply because he could. Each act was a stone dropped into the still water of his soul, and each time he would return to the loft, his heart pounding, and approach the portrait. The painting was changing faster now. The skin had taken on a sallow, almost jaundiced tone. The pimple had blossomed into a small, weeping sore. The eyes were bloodshot, the pupils dilated with a predatory hunger. The hair was lank, slightly greasy. It was still unmistakably him, but it was a Graham who had lived a hard, dissolute life. The beauty was still there, but it was being carved away, piece by piece, revealing the rotten core beneath. That night, he dreamed he was inside the painting. The world was two-dimensional, a landscape of oily smears. He could smell the turpentine and the faint, sweet odor of decay. From the confines of the frame, he could see his own body, sleeping peacefully in the bed, pristine and perfect. He tried to scream, to pound on the invisible barrier, but his fists made no sound. The only thing that broke the silence was the sound of a child, far away, laughing as they rang a doorbell. A sound that went on and on and on. He woke with a start, drenched in a cold sweat. The room was freezing. The portrait was uncovered, staring at him from across the dark room. In the faint light from the city, he saw its lips were parted in a silent snarl. Halloween morning dawned gray and cold. A thick, river-borne fog had swallowed the city, muffling the sounds of traffic and blending with the fake fog from haunted house attractions, until the world was a ghost of itself. Frost etched skeletal patterns on the window panes. Graham felt hollowed out, a shell being slowly filled with ice. Couldn't he eat? The thought of food, of the sticky sweetness of candy corn, or the cloying richness of a caramel apple, made him nauseous. Lindsay called. Her voice was small, tentative over the phone. Graham, I am worried about you. Please, let us just talk. Come over tonight. We can hand out candy to the kids. It'll be like old times. He almost said yes. The memory of those old Halloweens was a warm, distant light, Hugh dressed as a pirate, Lindsay as a witch with a cute felt hat, the three of them laughing, their breath misting in the cold air, the simple joy of giving Snickers bars to tiny ghosts and superheroes. It felt like a story about someone else. I can tea, he said, his voice rough. I have plans. A long silence. Okay, she whispered. Happy Halloween, Graham. He hung up. The words felt like an epitaph. He spent the day staring at the portrait. The decay was accelerating. A network of fine lines had etched themselves around the eyes. A cold sore had appeared on the lower lip. The expression was one of smug, knowing corruption. It was the face of a man who had looked into the abyss and found it agreeable. Justin came by as dusk began to fall, the most dangerous time of day, the magic hour when the veil was at its thinnest. He brought a bottle of absinthe and a cruel smile. It's All Hallows Eve, Gray. The night the dead walk. Why shouldn't he, the damned, have their fun too? Down on the streets, the ritual began. The first trick-or-treaters appeared, tiny dinosaurs and princesses clutching the hands of parents, their voices piping and excited. Then came the older kids, the monsters and slashers, their laughter louder, more reckless. The doorbells of the building chimed in a constant, erratic symphony. Graham drank the absinthe, the licorice taste coating his tongue, feeling like poison. With every sip, he felt a corresponding warmth in his own body, a false vitality, while the cold from the portrait intensified. He could see his breath in the air of the loft now. "It is almost time," Justin said, his eyes fixed on Graham with the intensity of a scientist observing a groundbreaking experiment. The ultimate test, a true act of transference. "What do you mean?" Graham slurred. "The girl, Lindsay. She still loves the man in this painting," Justin said, nodding toward the pristine, sleeping form of Graham in the real world. "But that man is a fiction. The real you is in there." He pointed to the corrupted portrait. "Show her. Be cruel. Break her completely. Let the portrait absorb that final, beautiful act of malice. It will be the final piece. A part of Graham, the part that remembered roasting pumpkin seeds, recoiled. But it was a small, weak voice, drowned out by the roaring in his ears, and the seductive, logical purr of Justin S. words. It was the only way to be free, to be perfect. He called her. "Lindsay," he said, his voice dripping with a false warmth. "I was wrong. Come over, please. I need to see you." While he waited, he stood before the portrait. The transformation was nearly complete. The handsome youth was gone, replaced by a dissipated, middle-aged predator. The eyes were yellowed and cunning, the skin pockmarked and loose. The hair was thinning. Only the structure of the bone remained to hint at the beauty it had once held. It was the cost of every lie, every cruelty, every moment of indulgence, laid bare. Lindsay arrived. She was dressed in a simple, old-fashioned costume, a shepherdess with a lace bonnet. She looked hopeful and heartbreakingly young. The moment she stepped into the Arctic chill of the loft, her smile faltered. "Graham, it is so cold in here." "Come in, Lindsay," he said, his back to the portrait. "I want to show you something." He stepped aside. Lindsay's eyes fell upon the painting. Her hand flew to her mouth, a stifled gasp. She looked from the grotesque image to Graham's own flawless face, her mind refusing to connect the two. What is this?" she stammered. "What is happening?" "That is the real me, Lindsay," Graham said, the words like shards of glass in his throat. He was following Justin's script, but the words felt like his own. "The one you've been clinging to, that boy from the pumpkin carving days, he never existed. This is what I am. This is what I've always been underneath. You were just too naive to see it." He continued, each word a carefully aimed dagger, tearing down their shared history, mocking her love, her innocence, her hope. He told her he had never loved her, that she was a convenience, a joke he shared with Justin. Lindsay listened, her face crumbling piece by piece. The light in her eyes didn't just go out. It was extinguished, violently. She didn't cry. She just stared at him with a hollow, broken look, as if he had reached inside her and removed something essential. When he was finished, she turned without a word and walked out, the door clicking shut with a sound of finality. Graham stood panting, the adrenaline coursing through him. He felt powerful, invincible, He had done it. He had transferred the last of his weakness, his sentiment. He turned to look at the portrait, expecting to see the final, glorious transformation into a pure, unburdened icon of decadence. The portrait was gone. In its place was a perfect, shimmering silver rectangle, like a mirror wiped clean. A wave of relief, so profound it made his knees weak, washed over him. It was over. The curse was broken. The portrait had absorbed it all and vanished. He was free. He was still beautiful. He had won. He walked toward the empty space on the wall, a laugh bubbling in his chest. He would call Justin. They would celebrate. He reached out a hand to touch the wall where the frame had been. His fingers met not plaster, but a cold, slick, familiar surface. Canvas. His reflection did not appear in the silver. Instead, the surface rippled like mercury, and then the image began to reform. It was his loft, rendered in perfect, horrifying detail. And standing in the center of the painted room, his back to the viewer, was a man. He had Graham-esque build, his clothes. He was staring at a spot on the wall within the painting itself. The man in the portrait turned around. It was the face from the final stage of the decay, the dissipated, cruel, middle-aged face. It looked out from the canvas, its yellowed eyes meeting Graham's own, and it smiled a slow, triumphant, and utterly vile smile. Graham stumbled back, a raw, animal sound tearing from his throat. He looked down at his own hands. They were smooth, young, unblemished. He ran to the large mirror in his bathroom, his heart hammering against his ribs. The face that stared back was perfect. The face from the original portrait. The golden boy. The beautiful, empty vessel. But the eyes were wrong. They were not his own. They were the weary, bloodshot, knowing eyes from the painting in its final stages. He was a young man's body with an old sinner's soul staring out from behind the windows. He screamed, but the sound was muffled, trapped in the pristine prison of his flesh. The world outside continued its Halloween revelry. The doorbell chimed over and over. Children shouted trick or treat. Laughter, both real and feigned, echoed up from the streets. The orange glow of 1,000 jack-o'-lanterns pulsed against the foggy night. A cosmic joke played on a world that thought the monsters were all in costume. Graham's mind, unable to bear the contradiction, began to fray at the edges. The present was too sharp, too horrifying. It began to recede, to soften, pulling back into the safety of a time before the portrait, before the corruption, before the chill. He is no longer in the cold loft. He is standing on a porch, the wooden planks smooth and familiar under his feet. The air is crisp, smelling of burning leaves and cinnamon. It is Halloween years ago. Hugh is next to him, a cardboard sword tucked into his belt. Lindsay is there, her hand warm in his, her smile bright enough to banish any darkness. She is holding a basket of candy, and she presses a miniature chocolate bar into his palm. "For you," she says, her voice like music. Down the street, the The tiny, glowing lights of jack-o'-lanterns bob like will-o'-the-wisps, guiding the way home. A group of children in sheets and store-bought masks run past, their laughter pure and untainted, a sound of uncomplicated joy. The harvest moon hangs low in the sky, a perfect, benevolent orange. It is a perfect night, a safe night. He is young and he is loved, and the world is full of nothing but promise and the sweet, simple taste of chocolate. He holds onto this memory, this single, perfect snapshot of a life that once was his. He clutches it tight as the world outside the memory, the real world of cold lofts and cursed paintings, fades to a distant, meaningless hum. He stands on that porch forever, smiling his empty, beautiful smile, watching the children run through the autumn leaves, waiting for a Halloween that will never come. The chocolate was a solid, comforting weight in his hand. He could feel the foil wrapper, the sharp corners of the bar inside. He focused on that sensation, the only real thing in a world that had become a waking nightmare. Lindsay's hand in his was warm, so warm. He could feel the pulse in her wrist, a steady, living rhythm against his own skin. "Gray," she said, her voice laced with a concern that belonged to a different time, a different Graham. "You ray squeezing my hand too tight." He looked down at her. The lace of her bonnet framed a face untouched by the pain he had just inflicted upon her. Hugh was laughing at something, his head thrown back, the picture of easy friendship. This was the past. This was a memory, but it felt more solid, more immediate than the cold loft and the thing on the wall. He tried to speak, to warn them, to tell them to run from the man he would become. But his mouth, wouldn't he form the words? The script of this memory was fixed, immutable. He was just a passenger in his own body, a ghost haunting a happier time. The scene began to flicker at the edges. The warm orange of the pumpkins bled into the sickly sodium glow of a street lamp. The children's laughter twisted, becoming the harsh, mocking caw of a crow. Lindsay's face started to dissolve, her smile melting into an expression of hollow betrayal. No, he thought, clinging desperately. Not yet. He concentrated on the chocolate, on the feel of the foil. He poured every ounce of his will into that small, simple object, using it as an anchor to hold him in this stolen moment. The flickering stopped. The porch stabilized. The laughter was joyful again. He had forced the memory to hold, but the cost was a profound psychic exhaustion. He could feel the two realities grinding against each other. In one, he was a young man on a porch, loved. In the other, he was a prisoner in a beautiful body, staring into the eyes of his own damned soul. The strain of holding both at bay was immense. A new sensation began to bleed through the memory, a physical one. A coldness, not in the air around him, but deep within his own chest. It was the chill from the portrait, the winter he had transferred onto the canvas. It had not vanished with the painting. It had simply come home to roost, settling in the hollow where his conscience used to be. He felt it spreading through him, a glacial numbness that promised to freeze the panic, the fear, the regret. It promised a quiet end to the screaming in his mind. He let it. The memory of the porch, of Lindsay S. hand, of the chocolate bar, began to feel distant, like a show on a television in another room. The details grew soft, then faded to a pleasant, generic blur. He was on a porch. It was Halloween. He was happy. That was all that mattered. The Graham in the real world, the one standing in the center of the freezing loft, slowly lowered his hand from his face. The scream that had been building in his throat died into a soft, placid sigh. His expression smoothed into one of vacant serenity. He walked to the window and looked down at the celebrating city, at the tiny, costumed figures below. He felt nothing. The cold inside him was complete, a perfect insulation against the world. He was free, just as Justin had promised. He had transferred everything. His vanity, his cruelty, his decay were all captured in the phantom portrait that now hung in a place he could no longer see. All that was left was the beautiful, empty shell. And the cold. He would remain that way, a walking monument to bargain fulfilled, forever young, forever flawless, and forever frozen in a single, perfect Halloween moment that never truly was. The doorbell rang again, a shrill, impatient sound. Didn't he hear it? He was already miles and years away, waiting for the next piece of candy, a smile etched permanently on his perfect, unfeeling face. The silence in the loft was absolute now, a stark contrast to the fading echoes of the night's festivities. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the windows like a suffocating blanket. Graham remained at the window, a statue framed by the gloom. The cold within him was not an absence of heat, but an active presence, a glacial core that radiated stillness. He was aware, in a detached, academic way, that he should feel something. Horror at his predicament, grief for Lindsay, despair for his own soul. But the emotions were like words in a book written in a language he no longer understood. The cold had scoured him clean. A key turned in the lock. The door opened, and Justin stepped in, brushing fake cobwebs from his shoulder. His eyes were bright with a manic energy, and he carried the lingering scent of smoke and cheap perfume. "Well?" Justin asked, his voice cutting through the sterile quiet. "A resounding success, I take it. The final transference is complete. You are a new man, Gray, a pure being, unburdened." Graham turned from the window. His movement was fluid, effortless, but devoid of any personal signature. It was the motion of a well-made doll. "Yes," Graham said. The word was correct, but the tone was flat, devoid of the triumphant resonance Justin clearly expected. Justin's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked around the room, his gaze searching for the portrait. "Where is it? I must see the masterpiece, the vessel that holds your former weakness." "It's gone," Graham replied, his eyes looking past Justin, through him. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Justin strode to the center of the room, his confidence giving way to a petulant confusion. That's impossible. The magic doesn't work that way. It doesn't just vanish. It has to be somewhere. It is somewhere, Graham said, his voice a soft, chilling monotone. I am here. Justin stared at him, truly looking at him for the first time since entering. He saw the perfect, unlined face, the sculpted features. But then his eyes met Graham's, and he took an involuntary step back. The eyes were wrong. They were not the bright, cynical eyes of his protege. They were old, weary, and deeply, profoundly cold. They were the eyes from the final portrait. You didn't transfer it all, Justin whispered, a dawning horror on his face. You swapped. The essence. It's in you. But the vessel. I am the vessel, Graham stated. The portrait got the life. I got the shell. This was not the outcome Justin had envisioned. He had wanted a companion in damnation. A vibrant, cruel equal, not this. This beautiful automaton with a ghost looking out from behind its eyes. This was a failure. An aberration. No, Justin said, his voice rising in panic. This is wrong. We can fix this. We can find the painting. We can burn it. He began to pace, a caged animal, muttering about rituals and reversals. His philosophy, his cruel art, had produced a result he could not control, could not even comprehend. The student had become a permanent, chilling monument to the teacher's folly. Graham watched him dispassionately. Justin's panic was a distant, meaningless phenomenon, like the patter of rain on the roof. The cold inside him was absolute. It was his only truth now. He was no longer a man who felt cold. He was cold itself, wearing the shape of a boy. He turned back to the window. The last of the trick-or-treaters had gone home. The orange glow of the jack-o'-lanterns was being extinguished one by one, surrendering to the gray dawn. He didn't move. He simply waited, not for a salvation that would never come, but for the next inevitable, unfeeling moment. The doorbell would not ring again. Justin's frantic pacing slowed, then stopped. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He was a man who dealt in dramatic effects, in grand gestures of corruption. But this stillness, this absolute nullity in his friend, was something entirely new and terrifying. He had aimed to create a demon, but he had instead crafted a perfect, beautiful void. Graham, he said, his voice tentative, losing its customary purr. Say something else. Graham continued to look out the window. The first hint of a pallid dawn light was beginning to bleach the darkness from the sky. The sun is rising, he observed. There was no poetry in the statement, no relief, no dread. It was merely a report of a celestial event. Justin's shoulders slumped. The thrill was gone, replaced by a creeping, mundane dread. He had won. He had proven his theory. The transference was real. And in doing so, he had destroyed his only true companion, replacing him with this elegant shell. The loft, once a stage for their decadent experiments, now felt like a tomb. The cold was no longer an interesting atmospheric effect. It was the climate of his failure. "I should go," Justin muttered, more to himself than to Graham. He needed a drink, a different scene, a person he could still affect. He needed to feel powerful again. Graham offered no response, no farewell, not even a glance. He was fixed on the horizon, a sentinel for a kingdom of one. Justin let himself out, the click of the latch unnaturally loud in the quiet. The sound did not register in Graham's world. His attention had turned inward to the meticulously maintained memory of the porch. He replayed it, not with joy or nostalgia, but with the methodical precision of a machine reading a data strip. The warmth of Lindsay's hand, the taste of the chocolate, the sound of Hugh's laugh. He could access the sensory information, but it elicited no emotional response. The memory was a fossil, and he was the museum it was stored in. Days began to pass, or perhaps it was only hours. Time had lost its meaning. He did not eat, yet he felt no hunger. He did not sleep, yet he felt no fatigue. The cold sustained him. He would stand for long periods, or sit perfectly still, his flawless face a mask of tranquility. Sometimes he would catch his reflection in the dark screen of the television. The young man staring back was a stranger, a handsome ghost haunting his own life. A week after Halloween, the building's superintendent used a master key to enter. Alerted by neighbors about a lingering, unnatural chill in the hallway, he found Graham standing in the center of the living room, dressed in the same clothes from that night, his posture erect, his eyes open and clear. The air was frigid. "Mr. Alden, you all right? Your rent is overdue." Graham turned his head slowly. The movement was so smooth it was unnerving. "Yes," he said. "I am perfectly all right." The superintendent, a pragmatic man, felt a primal fear twist in his gut. The guy looked fine, better than fine. He looked like a movie star, but the eyes were dead. And the cold it was wrong. "You gotta keep the heat on, man. It's November." He shuffled over to the thermostat, turning the dial. The furnace kicked on with a rumble, pumping warm air into the room. The temperature began to climb, but the cold emanating from Graham seemed to push back against it, creating a pocket of winter around him. Graham watched the superintendent's actions without curiosity. He felt the change in the air, the warmth lapping at the edges of his personal frost, but it could not penetrate. The cold was not around him. It was in him. It was him. The superintendent left, muttering about rich weirdos. The world continued its business outside. Life, with all its messy emotions and desperate needs, went on. But inside the loft, time was held in check. Graham was no longer living his life. He was curating it. He was the final, perfect portrait, and the beautiful, frozen boy in the frame would never age, never change, and never, ever feel a thing again. The superintendent's visit became a monthly occurrence, a reluctant check on a tenant who paid his rent automatically from an account that never seemed to dwindle. Each time, he found the loft in immaculate, sterile order, and Graham in the same state of placid stillness. The heat would be off, the windows sometimes open to the winter air, and Graham would be wearing the same thin shirt and slacks. The man never complained, never asked for anything. He just was. One afternoon, a different visitor came. Lindsay. She stood outside the door for a long time, gathering her courage. She had heard things, strange rumors from the building manager about the cold and the silence. She told herself she was coming for closure, to finally see the ghost of the man she had loved and lay him to rest. She knocked. There was no answer, but after a moment, the door unlocked itself with a soft click. She pushed it open. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. And there he was, standing near the window, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light. He turned, and for a heart-lifting, terrible second, she saw the beautiful boy she had fallen for. The same perfect features, the same golden hair. "Graham," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her, and the hope in her chest withered and died. His eyes were not those of a 25-year-old man. They were ancient, weary, and held a chill that made the room's temperature feel warm by comparison. They were the eyes of the bitter, aged stranger she had glimpsed in his face on that last, awful night. "Lindsay," he said. Her name in his mouth was not a greeting, not a recognition of their shared past. It was a simple, flat identification, like a librarian noting the title of a book. I came to see how you are," she managed, wrapping her arms around herself. "I am well," he replied. He offered a smile. It was a perfect, beautiful smile, the one that had once made her heart flutter. Now, it was a horrifying mockery, an empty gesture performed by a thing that had forgotten what joy felt like. She looked around the loft. It was clean, but it felt abandoned. There was no mail, no discarded coffee cups, no signs of life. On the wall where he used to keep a small print, there was a faint, rectangular discoloration in the paint. A ghost of a ghost. "What happened to you, Gray?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. "What did you do?" He considered the question, his head tilted as if accessing a distant file. "I achieved a state of permanence," he stated. "The process was a success." "What process?" Her voice broke. "This isn't success. This is death." He blinked, the motion slow and deliberate. "No, it is purity. There is no more decay, no more regret. There is only the form." She realized then that she was not speaking to Graham. Graham was gone. Whatever this was, it was just the container, the beautiful, cursed jar that had held his soul. And now the jar was empty, save for the lingering frost of what had been trapped inside. She backed away, unable to bear the sight for another second. "Goodbye, Graham," she sobbed, though she knew it was pointless. He offered the same empty smile. "Goodbye, Lindsay." She fled, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the hallway. The door swung shut behind her, leaving him alone once more. He turned back to the window. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the grimy city in a temporary, fragile white. He watched it, noting the pattern, the way it clung to the windowsill. It was aesthetically pleasing. He felt no urge to touch it, no childhood nostalgia for snowball fights, no melancholy for winters past. It was just data. He was the curator of his own existence, and the exhibition was eternal. The beautiful boy in the frozen loft, a monument to a sin so profound it had erased the sinner, leaving only the perfect, unfeeling crime behind. And as the snow fell, he stood and watched, a timeless portrait in a frame of falling white. The snow continued its silent fall, layering the world outside in a hushed, monochrome blanket. Inside, the cold held its own against the feeble attempts of the season. Graham remained at his post by the window, a fixture as permanent as the building itself. The encounter with Lindsay had left no ripple on his still surface. Her tears, her anguish, were simply more data to be filed away and forgotten. He became a local legend, a story told in hushed tones, the beautiful ghost of the loft. Teenagers would dare each other to ring the bell on Halloween, but the door never opened again. They would sometimes see his silhouette in the window, a pale, motionless sentinel, and they would run, their hearts pounding with a thrilling fear. He was their personal specter, a part of the city's folklore. Years bled into one another. The city changed. Buildings were torn down, and new, glacier ones rose in their place. The neighborhood lost its bohemian edge, becoming sleek and commercial. Through it all, the loft remained, a sealed vault. The rent was always paid. The lawyers who managed the trust fund found the arrangement peculiar but profitable. They never visited. One day, a team of construction workers arrived. The building was being converted into luxury condominiums. They used a master key on the loft door, struggling against the strange, persistent cold that seeped from the frame. They found him standing in the center of the bare room. The last pieces of furniture had long since disintegrated into dust, but he remained, untouched by time. His clothes were the same, thin and outdated, yet they showed no wear. His face was still that of a young man, breathtakingly perfect. One of the workers, a burly man named Ray, approached him cautiously. "Hey, buddy, you gotta leave. This building's being demoed." Graham's eyes, those ancient, weary eyes, shifted to focus on Ray. The worker flinched, his bravado evaporating. "The structure is no longer required," Graham said, his voice the same soft, chilling monotone. It was the first time he had spoken in decades. Ray and his partner backed away, crossing themselves. They left him there, refusing to re-enter. The foreman was called, then the police, then finally, a confused team from a historical society who had heard the legends. They all saw the same thing, a perfectly preserved young man in an empty, freezing room. Doctors were baffled. His vitals were there, a slow, glacial pulse, a whisper of breath. But he was unresponsive to all stimuli, a living statue. He was declared a medical mystery, and eventually moved to a secure, private wing of a state institution, a specimen for quiet, bewildered study. He sits there now in a plain room, often positioned by a window. The orderlies, after the initial shock wore off, grew accustomed to him. They call him the prince. He never speaks, never ages, never blinks unless he chooses to. He requires no food, no water. The cold radiates from him still, a personal winter that no central heating can overcome, is the final perfected work of art. Justin S. masterpiece. A soul transferred, a vessel emptied, and a moment frozen for all eternity. He is not a man. He is a condition. He is the beautiful, silent, and permanent cold. And on his face, for the benefit of no one, rests the faint, flawless echo of a smile. Waiting for a Halloween that will never come again, the orderlies sometimes place a book near him, or turn on a radio, a futile human attempt to provide comfort or stimulus. The sounds of music or talk shows fill the room for a while, but they do not register. They are like wind against a mountain, a temporary noise that leaves no mark. His gaze, when it moves at all, follows the slow track of sunlight across the floor, or the fall of rain against the windowpane. He observes the world with the passive interest of a satellite, collecting information without judgment. One new orderly, a young woman named Chloe, felt a particular pang of sympathy for the silent, beautiful man. She would talk to him as she cleaned his room, telling him about her day, her boyfriend, her hopes. It was a one-sided conversation, but it made her feel less like she was tending to a statue. One afternoon, she was describing a movie she had seen, a tragic romance, and she found herself crying at the memory of the sad ending. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. As it fell, Graham's hand moved. It was the first voluntary movement anyone had witnessed in years. His fingers, pale and cool, rose with an impossible grace and caught the tear before it could hit the floor. He held it on his fingertip, staring at the tiny, perfect sphere. Chloe stared, her own tears forgotten, her breath caught in her throat. Graham looked from the tear to her face. His ancient eyes showed a flicker of something that was not quite recognition, but a form of analysis. He was examining the physical evidence of her emotion. "It is saline water," he stated, his voice a dry rustle from disuse. Approximately 98%. Chloe could only nod, her heart hammering against her ribs. He continued to look at the tear, then at her. "It serves a biological purpose," he said, "to lubricate the eye and to express distress." "Yes," Chloe whispered. He considered this. The cold in the room seemed to deepen, concentrating around his still form. "I remember distress," he said. The words were not nostalgic or sad. They were a simple report of a fact, like noting the temperature. It was inefficient. Closed his fingers, and when he opened them, the tear was gone, absorbed or evaporated. The moment of connection, if that is what it was, had passed. His hand returned to his lap, and his gaze drifted back to the window, leaving Chloe alone with the chilling echo of his words. He had not offered comfort. He had merely classified her sorrow, filing it away in the vast, frozen archive of his being. He was, as ever, the perfect curator, and the exhibition, it seemed, was still open to the public. Chloe never spoke of the incident to the other staff. To do so would be to break the unspoken rule of the place, which was to accept the Prince's existence without questioning its impossibility. She continued her duties, but her chatter ceased. She now moved through the cold silence of his room with a respectful dread, understanding that the being before her was not a man to be pitied, but a phenomenon to be witnessed. Months turned into years within the institution's quiet halls. Administrations changed, studies were published, and then forgotten, but the prince remained. He was a fixed point, a paradox that science had quietly abandoned. He was simply there. One autumn day, a new director, a man named Dr. Evans, decided to review the facility's long-term cases. He was a man of rigorous logic and modern methods, skeptical of the folklore that had grown around the patient known as Alden. He sat in the observation room, watching the live feed of the Prince's room. The young man sat in his chair by the window, as still as ever, catatonic schizophrenia of an unprecedented, persistent variety. Evans muttered to the head nurse, "The physical manifestations are baffling, but there must be a biochemical explanation. The low body temperature, the minimal metabolic function, it's a form of suspended animation." The nurse, a veteran who had been there for 20 years, simply nodded. She had stopped trying to explain it to men like Evans long ago. Dr. Evans decided on a new approach. He ordered a series of advanced neural scans. The team prepared the mobile unit with some trepidation, wheeling the heavy machine into the Prince's room. The air grew noticeably colder as they entered. They spoke to him in calm, clinical tones, explaining the procedure, though they expected no response. As they began to position the scanner around his head, his eyes shifted from the window to focus on the machine. The technicians froze. He had never reacted to medical equipment before. The purpose of this device, he asked, his voice clear and devoid of any emotion. Dr. Evans, watching from the observation window, leaned forward, his heart racing with professional excitement. "It's to take a picture of your brain, Graham, to help us understand you." Graham considered this. Understanding is a process of the mind. My mind is no longer a process. It is a state. A state of what? Evans pressed, his voice eager through the intercom. "Of being," Graham replied. He turned his head, a slow, smooth motion that made the technicians step back, and looked directly at the one-way glass. It was as if he could see Evans perfectly. "You seek a source for the cold. You will not find it in my brain. It is not housed there. It is me." He then turned back to the window, dismissing them as completely as if he had ceased to exist. No amount of prompting could elicit another word. The scans were performed, revealing a brain that was both perfectly healthy and profoundly dormant, its activity lower than that of a person in a deep coma, yet organized in a strange, symmetrical pattern that defied all known models. Dr. Evans was left with more questions than answers. The data was impossible. He eventually closed the file, labeling it an unsolvable anomaly. The prince had been measured, quantified, and yet had remained entirely untouched by the process. He was, as always, beyond their reach. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Graham watched the changing light. He did not see its beauty, but he registered its transition. He was aware of every shift in shadow, every gradation of color. He was a perfect, silent witness to a world of constant flux, a world he was forever separate from. He was the still point in the turning universe, and the cold was his proof. The seasons turned again. The world outside the institution S window cycled through its predictable patterns of bloom and decay. But the room remained a constant, sterile winter. Chloe eventually moved on, transferring to a different ward, her memory of the tear, and the cool, analytical voice fading into a strange, half-believed dream. New staff came and went, each generation inheriting the legend of the prince with a mixture of skepticism and awe, until his existence became as mundane and accepted as the worn linoleum floors. One quiet, uneventful night, an old man was admitted to the room next door. His name was Arthur, and he was in the final, frail stages of a long life. He was confused, his mind adrift in a sea of memories. The nurses, overworked and weary, often left his door ajar to better hear his calls. Through that open door, a sound drifted into the princess room. It was not music or speech, but a low, guttural, rhythmic noise. A sob. The sound was thick with a lifetime of pain, of love lost, of regrets that could never be mended. It was the raw, unfiltered sound of a soul in its final unraveling. Graham, who had not moved from his chair in weeks, slowly turned his head. His eyes, those ancient, frozen lakes, focused on the open doorway. The sound did not evoke pity or sadness. It was, like the tear, a phenomenon, but it was a more complex one. It was a symphony of distress, a data stream of pure, inefficient emotion. Arthur S. weeping continued, a desperate, lonely sound in the sleeping hospital. Then Graham spoke. His voice was the same as ever, a flat, quiet statement in the dark. "It is the same sound," he said to the empty room. The words hung in the frigid air. There was no one to hear them, no one to question what he meant. But he knew. He was accessing a file he had not opened in decades, a memory buried under layers of perfect, frozen silence. It was the sound Justin had made in those final, frantic moments before the transfer was complete. The raw, human terror of being erased. The prince had heard it then, and he had catalogued it, and now he was hearing it again. He listened until the sobs subsided into the shallow, ragged breaths of exhausted sleep. Then he turned back to the window. The moon was a cold, sharp sliver in the sky. He felt nothing for the old man. He felt nothing for the memory of Justin, but for the first time in his long, still existence, he became aware of a new variable. The data was repeating. The pattern of human conclusion was consistent. It was, he decided, an inelegant and noisy process, and he was glad it was one he had transcended. The weeping next door was just another exhibit, proof of the chaos he had left behind. He was the silence after the storm, permanent and unchanging. The days that followed were marked by a new, almost imperceptible shift in his routine. He began to spend more time observing the other patients during their scheduled time in the common garden, visible from his window. He watched their agitated movements, their sudden laughter, their quiet confusions. He was not studying individuals, but a system. He was analyzing the patterns of flawed, temporary beings as they moved toward their inevitable end. It was a long-term study in entropy. Dr. Evans, reviewing the logs, noted the change in focus, but could draw no conclusions. The prince was simply looking out a different part of the window. The mystery remained sealed. One afternoon, a young intern, bold and influenced by the legends, slipped into the Prince's room while the nurse was distracted. He stood before the chair, waving a hand in front of those unblinking eyes. "Hello," he whispered. "Can you hear me? What are you?" Graham's gaze did not waver from the window. The intern, feeling foolish and suddenly chilled to the bone, retreated. But as he reached the door, a voice stopped him. "I am the solution," Graham said, his tone as flat and factual as a textbook definition. The intern spun around. The solution to what? But the prince had returned to his silence. The answer, like the man himself, was complete and closed. It required no further elaboration. The solution was not for a problem, but to a condition. The human condition. He had solved it by ceasing to be human. He was the answer to a question no one had known how to ask properly. A resolution so absolute it had erased the need for the query itself. The intern fled, the words etching themselves into his memory. A riddle he would never solve. And Graham, the solution, continued his silent vigil, a monument to a victory that had cost him everything, and therefore nothing at all.